I stood at my parents' front door on Christmas Eve, holding my 10-year-old son's hand and a casserole dish I'd spent hours making. When my mother opened the door, her smile vanished. "Nadia, what are you doing here?" Her voice was ice. "It's Christmas Eve dinner. You invited me." "I said you were invited, not him." She glanced down at Ethan like he was something that needed to be swept away. "No children allowed. I told you that." My son's fingers tightened around mine. Inside, I could hear children laughing. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I stepped past her. What I saw stopped my heart cold. My sister's 3 kids were tearing into presents under the tree, presents wrapped in paper I recognized because I'd sent them. But the tags had been changed. "From Aunt Jess, though," they all read now. "Mom," I said quietly, "you said no children allowed." She didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. She just smiled that cold smile I'd known my entire life and said, "Those children deserve to be here." In that moment, 35 years of being the forgotten daughter crystallized into perfect clarity. I wasn't family. I was a bank account with a heartbeat. I took my son's hand, walked out, and drove home in silence. That night, while Ethan slept, I made 1 phone call to my attorney and sent 1 email to my bank. I canceled everything, every bill, every auto payment, every cent of the $300,000 I'd poured into that family over 15 years. They thought I was the ATM. They were about to learn I was the foundation. And when you remove the foundation, everything falls. What happened next shocked even me. My name is Nadia Cross. I'm 45 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've run Crosscare Home Services, a small elderly care agency that serves families across 3 counties. I built it from nothing after my divorce, working night shifts and double schedules to provide for my son, while other single mothers I knew were barely keeping their heads above water. People in our community know me as someone who shows up, who doesn't give up on the elderly clients everyone else has written off. What they don't know is that I learned to be invisible long before I learned to be indispensable. The casserole dish was still warm in my hands when I pulled into my parents' driveway on Christmas Eve. I'd made Mom's favorite, the green bean casserole with the crispy onions on top, the recipe she used to make when I was young, back before Jess was born, and I was still the center of someone's world. Ethan sat beside me in his good sweater, the navy one that didn't show stains, clutching the card he'd made for his grandparents. He'd drawn a family standing in front of a Christmas tree, all holding hands. In his version, everyone was smiling. "Mom, do you think Grandma will like my card?" His voice carried that tentative hope that broke my heart every time I heard it. At 10 years old, my son was still trying to earn love from people who'd made it clear he wasn't worth the effort. "She'll love it, honey?" I lied because that's what mothers do. We shield our children from truths they're too young to carry. The moment Margaret opened the door, I knew something was wrong. Her smile, the one she reserved for church ladies and neighbors, didn't reach her eyes. She stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance like a sentry, and looked past me to Ethan as if he were a stray dog that had followed me home. "Nadia," she said, my name sharp in her mouth. "What are you doing here?" The question caught me off guard. "It's Christmas Eve dinner. You called me last week and invited—" "I said you were invited." She cut me off, her voice dropping to that tone I'd learned to fear as a child, the one that preceded punishment. "Not him." The casserole dish felt suddenly heavy in my hands. "I'm sorry, what—" "No children allowed at dinner tonight. I specifically told you that." Her eyes flicked to Ethan, then away, as if looking at him too long might contaminate her somehow. "It's an adult evening." Behind her, drifting through the warm, cinnamon-scented air of the house I'd grown up in, I heard it. Children's laughter, high-pitched squeals of delight, the unmistakable sound of wrapping paper tearing. My sister's children. "Mom," I said slowly, carefully, the way you speak when you're trying to diffuse something explosive. "I can hear kids inside. Those are different." Margaret's face was stone, offering no explanation, no apology, nothing but the cold certainty that she was right and I was wrong for even questioning her. "This is a family dinner, Nadia. I expected you to understand appropriate boundaries." Ethan's hand found mine. His fingers were cold, despite his gloves, and I felt them trembling. Or maybe that was my own hand shaking. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn around to get back in the car, to drive away, and never return. But 35 years of conditioning of being the good daughter of swallowing humiliation and calling it family loyalty made me do the unthinkable. I looked down at my son and said, "Honey, why don't you wait in the car? I'll just be a minute." The confusion in his eyes was unbearable. "But Mom, I made a card." "I know, baby. Just wait in the car. Okay? Keep the heater running." I pressed my keys into his small hand and watched him walk back down the driveway, his shoulders hunched against more than just the December cold. Margaret stepped aside to let me in, and I forced myself forward, casserole dish still in hand like some kind of peace offering to a god who'd never wanted my worship in the first place. The living room was exactly as I remembered from childhood. The same floral sofa, the same china cabinet filled with figurines that Jess and I were never allowed to touch, the same family photos on the mantel, where I appeared less and less frequently as the years went on, eventually disappearing altogether after Jess's kids were born. But it was the Christmas tree that stopped me cold. My sister's 3 children, ages 4, 6, and 8, were sitting in a sea of torn wrapping paper and ribbons holding toys and games and electronics that seemed far too expensive for a family that was supposedly always struggling. The youngest was clutching a stuffed unicorn, and my heart lurched because I recognized it. I'd ordered it specifically from a specialty shop, spent $45 I probably shouldn't have spent, and included a note that said, "To Emma with love from Aunt Nadia." The gift tag tied to its horn read, "From Aunt Jess." I stood frozen, my eyes scanning the carnage of Christmas morning that had apparently come early for some people's children. Every present I'd wrapped with care, every gift I'd chosen thoughtfully, every card I'd written in my own hand, all of it retagged, relabeled, repurposed. My love had been stolen and repackaged as someone else's generosity. Jess sat on the couch, wine glass in hand, watching her children with the satisfied smile of a woman who'd never questioned whether she deserved good things. She looked up when I entered, and for just a moment something flickered across her face. Not guilt. Jess had never felt guilty about anything in her life, but acknowledgement. She knew I knew. "Nadia." She raised her glass in a mock toast. "Merry Christmas. Glad you could make it." I set the casserole dish down on the entry table, my hands finally free, though I didn't know what to do with them. "I brought green bean casserole." "Oh, how thoughtful." Margaret's voice came from behind me, saccharine and false. "You always were so good at following recipes." The words were benign, but I heard what lay beneath them. "You're good at doing what you're told. You're useful. You're the help." "Mom," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "You told me no children were allowed tonight." Margaret moved past me to straighten a bow on the tree, her movements casual, unconcerned. "I said your situation wasn't appropriate for tonight's gathering. These children belong here. They're part of the family celebration." "And Ethan isn't—" She turned to face me then, and the look she gave me was the same one she'd given me 1,000 times throughout my childhood, the look that said I was being difficult, unreasonable, selfish, for wanting what everyone else received without asking. "Those children deserve to be here, Nadia. They're innocent. They didn't ask to be born into complicated circumstances." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Neither did Ethan. Neither did I. But we'd both been paying for circumstances beyond our control since the day we were born. I looked at my sister, who wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at my mother, who met them with cold certainty. I looked at the presents that should have had my name on them, at the family that had gathered without the family members they'd deemed unworthy. And something inside me that had bent and bent and bent for 35 years finally snapped. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't make a scene. I simply turned around, walked out the door, and got into my car where my son sat in the passenger seat, his homemade card still clutched in his hands. "Are we going back in?" he asked, his voice so small it barely registered above the sound of the heater. "No, honey. We're going home." We drove in silence, the Christmas lights of our neighborhood blurring past the windows. Ethan didn't ask why. He never asked why anymore. He'd learned, as I had learned before him, that some questions didn't have answers you wanted to hear. When we pulled into our driveway, he finally spoke. "Mom." His voice cracked, hovering between childhood and the edge of something harder. "Why does Grandma hate me?" I turned off the engine and sat in the darkness, watching the reflection of our neighbor's Christmas lights dance across the windshield. Red, green, gold, white, all of them beautiful, none of them ours. "She doesn't hate you, baby," I whispered, but even I didn't believe it anymore. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and my phone. I opened my banking app and looked at the automatic payments I'd set up years ago. Property taxes for their house, their mortgage payment, their car insurance, the monthly grocery allowance, Jess's credit card that I'd been paying off for 3 years, the utilities, the streaming services, the phone bills. 15 years of automatic payments. 15 years of being the invisible foundation holding up a house that had no room for my son. I looked at the Christmas lights reflecting on my windshield one last time through the kitchen window, and I whispered to the empty room, "It ends tonight." One by one, I canceled them all. The click of each canceled payment felt like unlocking chains I'd been wearing so long, I'd forgotten they weren't part of my skin. But sitting there in the glow of my laptop screen, I couldn't help but wonder how I'd become the kind of person who needed permission to stop being used. The answer, I knew, lay buried in a childhood I'd spent decades trying to reframe as normal. I was 7 years old the first time I understood that love in our house was rationed, and Jess got the larger portion. It was my birthday, and Mom had made a sheet cake decorated with purple flowers, my favorite color. When it came time to cut it, she divided it down the middle, but the knife somehow angled, giving Jess's half noticeably more frosting roses. When I pointed it out, Mom's face hardened in that way that made my stomach drop. "Don't be greedy, Nadia. You're the older sister. You should be more mature about these things." Jess was 5. I was learning that maturity meant swallowing disappointment and calling it fairness. The pattern repeated itself so consistently, it became the rhythm of our household. New school clothes arrived each August, and Mom would hold up each item considering. "This would look so pretty on Jess," she'd say, and into Jess's closet it would go. "This is more practical for you, Nadia." Practical meant plain. It meant durable. It meant clothes that could survive being handed down when Jess inevitably decided she wanted them instead. By the time I was 12, I couldn't remember the last time I'd worn something new that hadn't touched my sister's skin first. When I finally worked up the courage to ask why Jess always got first choice, Mom looked at me like I'd said something vulgar. "Because she appreciates beautiful things, Nadia. You've always been more sensible." Sensible was a prison sentence delivered as a compliment. The bedroom situation was perhaps the cruelest lesson. I'd had the larger room at the end of the hall since we'd moved into the house when I was 9. It had a window seat where I'd read for hours, my private corner of peace. When Jess turned 11, she decided she wanted that room because it got better light for her art projects. I came home from school one day to find my belongings already moved into the smaller room, my books stacked in boxes, my posters rolled up and leaning against the wall. "Jess needs the creative space," Mom explained, as if that settled everything. "You don't mind, do you? You're always so understanding." Understanding had become another word for erasable. Christmas mornings were studies in contrast. Jess would tear through packages containing dolls' art sets, and eventually a laptop, a phone, a camera. My pile contained socks, notebooks for school, a scientific calculator I'd needed anyway. One year I received a cookbook with a note from Mom that said, "Every woman should know how to make a man happy." I was 15. Jess got a trip to New York City to see Broadway shows. When I asked Dad quietly if the gifts seemed uneven, he looked uncomfortable and muttered something about Mom knowing what each of us needed. What I needed, apparently, was to learn my place. But it was the kitchen fire that crystallized everything the moment that showed me exactly how little my safety mattered compared to preserving Jess's image. I was 14, Jess was 12, and we were making dinner because Mom was at a church meeting. Jess had decided to fry chicken despite never having done it before, and she'd turned the heat too high. When the grease ignited, shooting flames toward the curtains, I didn't think. I grabbed her arm and yanked her backward away from the stove. The fire caught the edge of my sleeve, and I felt the searing pain as it burned through to my skin. I managed to smother the flames with a dish towel, got the pan covered, and dragged Jess outside just as Mom's car pulled up. I expected concern, maybe even gratitude. What I got was fury. "The tablecloth!" Mom shrieked, rushing past us into the kitchen where smoke was still clearing. My grandmother's antique linen tablecloth, which had been draped over a chair near the stove, had caught fire and was ruined. Mom stood there holding the charred fabric tears streaming down her face while I clutched my burned arm. "How could you let this happen, Nadia? Do you have any idea what this meant to this family? It survived 3 generations." "I survived too," I wanted to say, but my throat had closed around the words. The burn on my arm required weeks of treatment, left a scar that's still visible when I wear short sleeves. Mom took me to the doctor once, then said I was old enough to change my own bandages. But that tablecloth was mourned for months. What I didn't know until years later was that Mom had told the church ladies a different story entirely, one where Jess had heroically pulled me away from the flames where my younger sister had saved my life. The lie spread through our community, and Jess never corrected it. She accepted the praise, the reputation for bravery, with the same ease she'd accepted everything else that should have been mine. At 16, standing in the church bathroom, I heard Mom's voice drifting through the door. She was talking to her friend Linda, and I froze when I heard my name. "Oh, Nadia's fine," Mom was saying. "She's always been so independent, so self-sufficient. But Jess is the reason this family exists. She's the light of our lives, you know, the joy." Not both daughters, just Jess. I stared at my reflection in the mirror and saw myself clearly for the first time, a girl-shaped absence, a shadow cast by someone else's brightness. That week I got a job at Meadowbrook Nursing Home, lying about my age, taking the evening shift that nobody else wanted. If my own family couldn't see my value, maybe I could find it in taking care of people who actually needed me. Mrs. Chen in room 304 held my hand during her last days and called me her angel. Mr. Phillips taught me to play chess and said I had a gift for thinking 3 moves ahead. They saw me. They remembered my name. One night after a particularly hard shift, I came home to find Jess waiting up in the kitchen. She looked guilty about something, and after a long silence she said, "I know things aren't fair, Nadia. One day I'll make it up to you, I promise." She hugged me, and for a moment I believed her. I believed that acknowledging the imbalance meant she'd work to correct it, that promises made at midnight carried weight. I never heard those words again. The skills I learned at Meadowbrook Nursing Home became more than just a paycheck. They became my escape route from a family that had never wanted me to succeed on my own terms. After high school, while Jess went off to a state university on Mom and Dad's dime, I enrolled in community college and kept working nights. My classes were medical terminology, basic nursing care, business management, squeezed between double shifts. I'd come home at 2 in the morning smelling like antiseptic and exhaustion study until dawn, sleep 3 hours, and do it again. Mrs. Chen's daughter once told me I had a gift for making people feel seen in their final days. I understood invisibility intimately enough to recognize it in others. By the time I was 30, I'd built cross-care home services from nothing but determination and a small business loan I qualified for by sheer force of a perfect payment history. The name came to me during a particularly difficult overnight shift with Mr. Kowalski, who kept calling me by his late wife's name. Cross for my last name. Care for what I'd learned to give strangers better than I'd ever received from blood. We started small, just me and two part-time aides serving elderly clients whose families were too busy or too far away. I specialized in the patients other agencies rejected, the difficult ones, the dying ones, the ones who reminded everyone that we're all headed toward needing help we can't repay. Marriage came at 28 with David, a teacher I met at a community fundraiser who seemed kind and steady. We had Ethan 2 years later, and for a brief window I thought I'd built something whole and mine. Then came Ethan's 2-year checkup, and the pediatric cardiologist's gentle voice explaining congenital heart defect surgery, lifetime monitoring, uncertain prognosis. David lasted 6 months after the diagnosis. He didn't leave with cruelty or drama. He just came home one evening, packed a bag, and said he couldn't handle watching our son struggle, couldn't handle the medical bills that were already piling up, couldn't handle the fear that never went away. I wanted to rage at him, to call him a coward, but I was too tired, and there was a toddler with a weak heart who needed his next cardiology appointment scheduled. So I let David go and added weekend shifts to my schedule. The community noticed that I never missed a client visit, never canceled when Ethan had a bad night, never complained when families called at midnight, panicking about their elderly parents. I became known as the woman who showed up, who could be counted on, who carried weight without breaking. What they didn't see were the nights I sat in my car in hospital parking lots crying where my son wouldn't hear, terrified that my best wouldn't be enough to keep him alive. But I learned to turn terror into fuel, and cross-care grew because grief has a way of teaching you what actually matters. Then came the phone call that would establish the pattern for the next 15 years. I was 32 when Dad called, his voice shaking in a way I'd never heard before. The IRS had placed a lien on their house. $47,000 in unpaid taxes, penalties, accumulating daily foreclosure proceedings already initiated. He didn't explain how it happened, just that it had, and could I possibly help? Mom got on the line, and her tone was different than Dad's desperation. She was matter-of-fact, almost entitled. "We need $47,000 by next Friday, Nadia. I assume you have savings from that business of yours." I had savings. Ethan's medical fund, carefully built from every extra dollar I could squeeze from my budget. But I heard myself saying I'd figure something out. Heard myself at the bank 3 days later, taking a second mortgage on my modest house, watching the loan officer's eyebrows rise when I said it was for family emergency. The check cleared on Thursday. I drove it to their house myself, handed it to Dad, watched Mom barely glance at it before setting it on the counter like it was a utility bill. Her thank you came as she was walking away toward the kitchen. "Well, you did owe us for raising you." 6 words that redefined 32 years of my life as a debt to be repaid. There was no family dinner to celebrate the house being saved. No acknowledgement at church, where Mom loved to broadcast every kindness anyone showed her. I went home, looked at my own mortgage statement that had just doubled, and told myself this was what daughters did. Duty, not love. But I kept that canceled check in a fireproof box filed under documents I hoped I'd never need. After that, the requests never stopped. They just became expectations. Property tax bills forwarded to my address with sticky notes that said, "Can you handle this?" Car repairs that Dad would mention casually, knowing I'd ask how much and then send money. Jess's boutique that failed within 8 months, leaving $12,000 in unpaid supplier debts that somehow became my responsibility because you wouldn't want your sister's credit ruined, would you? I set up automatic payments because it was easier than the monthly phone calls asking for help. My bank account became a pipeline flowing directly into their lives while my own remained carefully budgeted. My house remained small, my car remained used but reliable. I lived modestly, not because I couldn't afford better, but because I was quietly funding a family that never once said my name with pride. Mom and Dad's house remained immaculate, fresh paint every 3 years, landscaping that won HOA awards. Jess drove new cars and posted vacation photos from beaches I'd never seen. My contribution was invisible, expected, and apparently infinite. Dad said it to me once, sitting in my living room looking around at my second-hand furniture and saying, "You're so good with money, Nadia. Not like the rest of us." He meant it as a compliment. I heard it as an assignment, a role I'd been cast in without audition. I was the responsible one, which meant I was responsible for everyone. Last week, the morning after I canceled every payment, I called Ava Martinez, an attorney who'd helped me establish Crosscare's legal structure years ago. I brought her 15 years of bank statements, mortgage papers, and that original canceled check for $47,000. She spent 2 hours reviewing everything, her expression growing darker with each page. Finally, she looked up at me and said words that I've been repeating to myself ever since. "Nadia, you're not supporting them. You're funding your own erasure." Ava's words hung in the air between us, but the truth was I'd already known I was being erased. I just hadn't realized how methodically it was being done. The first crack in my willful blindness came 3 years ago when I applied for a car loan to replace my dying Honda and was denied. The loan officer looked embarrassed as he slid the credit report across his desk, and I stared at a number that made no sense. My score had plummeted from 780 to 630 in a matter of months. There, in black and white, was an account I'd never opened. Capital Financial MasterCard, opened 18 months prior. Current balance $23,000, 4 late payments sent to collections. I called the credit card company from my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. The representative pulled up the account and confirmed the billing address was my parents' house, though the card had been used primarily in boutiques and restaurants across 3 states, and for a week-long Caribbean cruise I'd certainly never taken. When I demanded to see the application, they emailed a PDF that showed my signature, my social security number, my mother's maiden name for the security question. The signature was close enough to mine that I had to look twice, but I knew I hadn't written it. The application date coincided exactly with Jess's birthday trip that she'd posted all over social media, the one where she'd bragged about finally treating herself to luxury. Confronting them felt like walking into an ambush I should have seen coming. I drove to their house with the printed statements, my chest tight with an anger I wasn't sure I had permission to feel. Mom answered the door and knew immediately why I was there. Her face didn't show guilt, just irritation at being inconvenienced. Jess was already in the living room, and I realized this wasn't going to be a conversation, it was going to be a performance they'd already rehearsed. I laid the statements on the coffee table and asked the simplest question I could manage. "Did you open a credit card in my name?" Jess looked at Mom before answering, seeking permission, or maybe just confirmation of the script. "I needed help, Nadia. My credit was maxed out and I had an opportunity for this business training program in Jamaica. It was going to change everything." Mom jumped in before I could respond, her voice taking on that wounded tone she'd perfected over decades. I told her it was fine, that it's what sisters do. You have such good credit, and Jess needed a chance to rebuild her life. We were going to pay it back before you even noticed. $23,000. 4 late payments. Collections calls I'd started receiving at work. I asked if they understood this was identity theft, that people went to prison for this. And Mom's eyes filled with tears so quickly I almost believed they were real. "You'd destroy your sister over money. You'd send Jess to jail, ruin her children's lives because of something we did as a family. What kind of person are you, Nadia?" The question was designed to make me feel like the criminal, and the terrible thing was, it worked. I left that house feeling like I'd done something wrong by discovering their crime. I paid off that debt over 2 years, adding it to the invisible pile of obligations I carried. I told myself it was the last time that they'd learned their lesson, that confronting them had at least established a boundary, even if I'd been too weak to enforce consequences. I was wrong on every count. When Ava started her audit last week, the co-ownership discovery felt like finding out I'd been living in a house with hidden rooms. Harold had added my name to their property deed back in 2020, right after I'd paid that $47,000 to the IRS. Ava found the filing in public records, a quitclaim deed giving me 30% ownership, dated and notarized, Harold's shaky signature at the bottom. He'd never told me. Never mentioned that he'd tried in his own quiet way to acknowledge what I'd done. But here was the problem that made Ava's jaw tighten as she explained it to me. Margaret had taken out 3 separate home equity loans since then, each one requiring signatures from all owners. Each one bearing my name in handwriting that looked remarkably like mine, but wasn't. Ava showed me the documents side by side with my real signature from Crosscare's business papers. "Look at the capital N in your first name," she said, pointing. "You loop it twice. These only loop once. And the tail on your Y extends below the line in your real signature. These don't." Margaret had been practicing my signature probably from birthday cards I'd sent over the years, getting close enough to fool bank employees who processed hundreds of loans and never looked twice. This wasn't a desperate mistake. This was calculated systematic fraud. The audit revealed more. A Nordstrom card opened in my name 2 years ago, currently carrying a $4,000 balance for clothes I'd never worn. A payday loan from some predatory lender, $800 at 40% interest, that had ballooned to $1,500. A lease agreement for Jess's current apartment, my name listed as guarantor with my signature forged on every page. 2 utility accounts at addresses I'd never lived at, both showing late payments that were slowly poisoning my credit. Ava tallied it all with the grim efficiency of someone who'd seen this pattern before. $67,000 in total debt that I'd never authorized, never benefited from, never even known existed until it was already destroying my financial future. I remembered confronting Mom about the credit card, how she'd used the word selfish like a weapon. "Family helps family, Nadia. Stop being so selfish." She'd said it so many times over the years that I'd internalized it, made it the lens through which I viewed every boundary I tried to set. Wanting my own money was selfish. Questioning their spending was selfish. Protecting my credit score was selfish. The word had been weaponized so effectively that I'd spent years apologizing for having limits, paying debts I never owed as penance for the sin of wanting something for myself. Ava's voice brought me back to her office, to the present moment, to the stack of documents that detailed my family's crimes. She was looking at her computer screen, and something in her expression made my stomach drop before she even spoke. "Nadia, there's one more. A home equity loan taken out 2 months ago. $80,000. Your forged signature as co-owner is right here on the paperwork." $80,000 in forged debt should have been the moment I called the police. Ava had the documents ready, the evidence clear enough for criminal prosecution. But I sat in her office staring at my mother's practiced forgery of my signature and heard myself say, "I need to think about it." Ava's expression told me she'd seen this before, women who could identify their abuse perfectly but couldn't quite believe they deserved to escape it. The question that haunted me as I drove home wasn't whether they'd committed crimes. It was why I still felt guilty for discovering them. The answer lived in every Sunday sermon I'd heard growing up, in every church potluck where women my mother's age praised daughters who sacrificed everything for aging parents. Honor thy father and mother wasn't just a commandment in our community, it was the measure of a woman's character. I'd watched Mrs. Patterson care for her bedridden mother for 12 years, never complaining, held up as the gold standard of daughterly devotion. I'd seen Sarah Mitchell quit her teaching job to move back home when her father got sick, and the whole congregation celebrated her sacrifice like it was the only moral choice. The message was reinforced everywhere, woven so tightly into the fabric of how we were supposed to be women, that questioning it felt like questioning gravity. Good daughters sacrificed. Good daughters endured. Good daughters put family before self, always, without exception. Speaking against your parents wasn't just wrong, it was shameful, a public announcement that you'd failed at the most basic requirement of being female. I'd internalized this so completely that even now, sitting with evidence of systematic fraud, I felt like the villain in the story. They'd committed crimes against me for years, but I was the one who felt dirty for wanting it to stop. I'd tried to set boundaries once about 6 years ago, before the credit card incident. I'd told Mom I couldn't keep covering every emergency, that I needed to save for Ethan's future medical needs. She'd gone straight to Pastor Ruth, framing it as her daughter abandoning elderly parents in their time of need. The next Sunday, Pastor Ruth's sermon had been about the sin of selfishness, about adult children who forgot the sacrifices their parents made. She never said my name, but everyone knew. Women I'd known for years looked at me with disappointment. One actually pulled me aside to say she was praying for my heart to soften. I'd caved within a week, restored the payments, and learned that truth-telling came with a price I wasn't strong enough to pay. But deeper than the cultural programming, more insidious than community pressure, was the hope that wouldn't die no matter how much evidence proved it was fantasy. Some part of me still believed that the next payment, the next rescue, the next silent sacrifice would finally be enough to make Mom see me. Really see me. Not as a resource to exploit, but as a daughter worthy of love. This hope was a drug I couldn't quit, and Mom knew exactly how to dose it to keep me hooked. She'd go months treating me like an ATM, then suddenly call just to chat about her garden, her voice warm and interested. Or she'd mail a birthday card with a note that said, "Thinking of you, sweetheart." And I'd feel that old familiar flutter, that maybe this time sensation that made my chest ache. Every small kindness became proof that she could love me if I just tried harder, gave more, proved myself more completely. I was chasing a mirage across a desert I'd been walking my entire life, and the cruelest part was knowing it was a mirage but being unable to stop walking toward it anyway. I was addicted to the possibility of maternal love, to the idea that one day she'd look at me the way she looked at Jess and say she was proud. Like all addictions, it kept me returning to the source of my pain, convincing myself that this time would be different, even as the pattern repeated itself with mechanical precision. 3 days after my meeting with Ava, Pastor Ruth called and asked if we could talk. Not at church where everything was performance, but at her house. I almost said no, remembering that sermon from years ago, but something in her voice made me agree. She sat me down at her kitchen table with tea. Neither of us drank, and said words I'd needed to hear for 30 years. "Nadia, I've been watching your family a long time. Too long, probably. I should have spoken up sooner." She paused, gathering courage, or maybe just the right words. "Love without boundaries isn't love. It's control. When someone trains you to accept cruelty as care, to see exploitation as family loyalty, that's not family. That's captivity dressed up in Sunday clothes." I started to defend them, some automatic response about family being complicated, but she held up her hand. "I'm not finished. Your mother has been using the church, using me, using the idea of Christian duty to keep you trapped. I've been complicit in it, and I'm sorry. But you need to hear this clearly. True love requires mutual respect. What you've been in your entire life isn't love. It's a one-sided transaction where you pay and never receive anything but more bills." Then she asked the question that I've been turning over in my mind ever since, the question that cracks open everything I've built my understanding of family on. Are you supporting them because you love them, or because you're still trying to earn love that was never available? I couldn't answer. The question sat between us like something alive and dangerous. Ruth reached across the table and took my hand. "Some parents can't love the way children need. It's not the child's fault. It was never your fault, Nadia." That night I opened the journal I'd kept sporadically over the years and wrote one sentence that felt like both breakthrough and breakdown. "I've been paying rent to live in a family that never gave me a room." That sentence in my journal should have been the end of something, but it turned out to be just the beginning of a different kind of pain. 2 days after writing it, my phone started lighting up with notifications. Friends I hadn't heard from in months were texting me screenshots of Mom's Facebook post asking if everything was okay. The post itself was a masterpiece of calculated vagueness, just specific enough to identify me without actually saying my name. "Heartbroken this Christmas. Some people forget what family means. Praying for those who choose money over love." She'd even added praying hands and a broken heart digital props in her performance of maternal suffering. Within hours, the post had been shared 43 times. I watched the shares multiply through the screenshots people kept sending me, watched the comments pile up from people who knew just enough to be dangerous. "So sorry you're going through this, Margaret. Some children just don't appreciate everything. Family is everything. Praying for you. This is what's wrong with today's generation. No respect for their elders." Each comment was a small violence, a judgment rendered without trial, and Mom responded to every single one with variations of, "Thank you for your prayers. I'm trying to forgive." Forgive me for what she never specified, but the implication was clear enough. I was the villain in a story she'd been writing for 45 years, and now she was publishing it for the whole community to read. The worst part wasn't the strangers. It was watching people I knew, people who'd worked with me at cross-care fundraisers and church events, clicking that share button. They were broadcasting my supposed sins to their own networks, spreading Mom's narrative like a virus I had no immunity against. I wanted to respond, to post my own version with bank statements and forged signatures attached, but something stopped me. Maybe it was dignity, or maybe it was just knowing that no amount of evidence changes minds that have already chosen their story. The digital attack was bad enough, but it was Mrs. Bennett who turned it into a neighborhood campaign. She lived 3 doors down from my parents and had perfected gossip into an art form over her 72 years. I'd seen her do it to others, watched her destroy reputations over backyard fences and in grocery store checkout lines, but I'd always assumed she liked me well enough to spare me. I was wrong. She started at the grocery store, where I overheard her telling the cashier, "Such a shame about the Cross family. That daughter of theirs just cut them off completely, you know. Won't even help with their bills. They might lose the house." The cashier, a young woman who'd always been friendly to me, wouldn't meet my eyes when I reached her register. At church the following Sunday, I felt the weight of judgment before I'd even found a seat. Conversations stopped when I walked past, started up again in whispers once I'd passed. I sat in my usual pew with Ethan beside me, and no one sat within 2 rows of us on either side. It was quarantine, by consensus, the social equivalent of being marked with disease. After the service, as I was walking to my car, Linda Morrison approached me. I'd known Linda for 15 years, had helped care for her mother in her final months. She looked uncomfortable but determined, the expression of someone who believes they're doing the right thing even if it's unpleasant. "Nadia, I heard about what's happening with your parents," she said, her voice pitched low like we were discussing something shameful. "I just want you to know that I'm praying for you. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive whatever they've done and help them. They're old, and holding grudges against elderly parents, well, that's just not very Christian." She patted my arm and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with words caught in my throat like stones. The social isolation was effective and deliberate. Mom had weaponized decades of community relationships, calling in favors and sympathy she'd carefully banked over years of playing the perfect church lady. She knew that direct manipulation had stopped working on me, so she'd simply changed tactics. If she couldn't guilt me privately, she'd shame me publicly. If I wouldn't respond to her tears, maybe I'd respond to the community turning their backs on me. But it was Ethan who paid the highest price for my decision to stop enabling them. He came home from school 3 days into the new year, with his face carefully blank, the expression he'd learned to wear when something had hurt him too much to show. I was making dinner when he dropped his backpack by the door and said in a voice too controlled for a 10-year-old, "Jason Reeves says his mom told him you're mean to old people. He asked if that's why Grandma doesn't want to see us anymore." I turned off the stove and knelt down to his level, taking his hands in mine. They were cold, despite the heated house, and I could feel them trembling slightly. "What did you say to Jason?" "I said you're nice to old people, that it's your job, but he said his mom knows the truth about you." Ethan's voice cracked on the last word, and when he looked up at me, his eyes were full of a question I'd been dreading. "Mom, are we still a family, or are we bad people now?" The question destroyed something in me that had been barely holding together. I pulled him close and felt his small body shaking against mine, and I realized that my silence, my endurance, my years of taking abuse quietly to keep the peace hadn't protected him at all. It had taught him that love looks like accepting cruelty, that family means swallowing lies, that standing up for yourself makes you the villain. If I continued down this path of quiet suffering, I'd pass these lessons to my son like a poisonous inheritance. "We're not bad people, baby," I whispered into his hair. "We're people who are learning to stop accepting bad treatment. There's a difference." I held him until his shaking stopped, until his breathing evened out, and I made a decision that should have been made decades ago. Ethan deserved to see his mother stand up, even if it meant standing alone. The next morning, a certified letter arrived requiring my signature. My hands shook as I opened it, though some part of me already knew what it would say. Official foreclosure notice on my parents' property, citing 3 months of missed payments, warning of seizure proceedings if the debt wasn't cured within 30 days. I stared at the numbers at the address of the house I'd saved once before and felt nothing but a cold, clarifying certainty. I wasn't saving it again. The foreclosure notice sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I called Ava back. Part of me wanted to let it sit there forever, to pretend I hadn't seen it, to slip back into the comfortable numbness of pretending none of this was happening. But every time I looked at Ethan doing homework across from that letter, I remembered his question about whether we were bad people, and I picked up the phone. Ava answered on the second ring and said she'd been waiting for my call. She asked me to bring every financial document I had going back 15 years. It took me 2 days to gather everything, pulling statements from file cabinets and old email accounts, printing transaction histories that painted a picture I'd been refusing to see. When I spread it all across Ava's conference table, even I was shocked by the sheer volume. She spent 4 hours going through everything with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen financial abuse before and knew exactly what to look for. She created spreadsheets, cross-referenced dates, highlighted patterns I'd been too close to recognize. When she finally turned her laptop toward me, the number at the bottom made my vision blur. $127,000 in total obligations linked to my name through co-signing I didn't remember agreeing to, identity misuse I'd discovered too late, and forged signatures I'd never written. She'd organized it all by category and date, and the timeline told a story that made me feel sick. These weren't emergencies. The $47,000 to the IRS was real, but everything after that was luxury masquerading as necessity. The credit card debt that showed up in 2021 included charges at high-end boutiques' spa days and a Caribbean cruise that Jess had documented extensively on Instagram while I was working double shifts to cover Ethan's cardiology appointments. The payday loan from 2022 was taken out 3 days before Mom posted on Facebook about barely affording groceries, but the credit card statement from that same week showed a $500 dinner at the nicest steakhouse in the county. Ava pointed to charge after charge, her voice carefully neutral, but her meaning clear. I'd been funding a lifestyle I couldn't afford while they performed poverty for sympathy. The most damning evidence was in the patterns Ava highlighted in yellow. On the same days Mom posted about struggling financially, there were charges for luxury items. The day she shared a prayer request about not knowing how they'd make ends meet, Jess's card showed $300 at Nordstrom. The week Dad called crying about needing help with car repairs, there were restaurant charges totaling over $400. They'd been playing me and their social media audience, simultaneously extracting money from me while extracting sympathy from everyone else. Following Ava's carefully drafted templates, I spent an entire evening signing legal documents that felt like shedding skin I'd outgrown years ago but had been too afraid to shed. Cease and desist letters to Mom, Dad, and Jess, formally notifying them that I would no longer accept responsibility for any debts I hadn't personally and explicitly authorized in writing. Letters to every creditor holding fraudulent accounts, disputing the debts, and providing evidence that my signature had been forged or my identity misused. I closed the joint checking account I'd maintained with my parents for emergencies, though the only emergencies it had funded were their own poor choices. I removed my name from every auto payment I'd set up over the years, watching each cancellation confirmation arrive in my email like a small liberation. Then I froze my credit with all 3 bureaus, ensuring no one could open anything in my name again without jumping through hoops that would require my active participation. Ava watched me sign the final document and said something I'd been avoiding thinking about directly. You have grounds to press criminal charges for identity theft. The forged signatures alone would likely result in convictions. It's your choice, but you should know that option exists. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Criminal charges meant police reports, investigations, possible jail time for Mom and Jess. It meant making this public in a way I couldn't take back, turning family dysfunction into court records that anyone could access. I wasn't ready for that level of scorched earth, not yet. But knowing I could press charges if I needed to felt like having a weapon I hoped I'd never have to use. The property situation was more complicated, tangled up in legalities that made my head hurt. Ava's title search confirmed what she'd discovered earlier. Dad had added me to the deed as a 30% owner back in 2020, his silent acknowledgement of the $47,000 I'd paid to save their house. But Mom had taken out 3 separate home equity loans since then, including that recent $80,000 loan, and every single one required signatures from all owners. Every signature purporting to be mine was forged, traced from my handwriting on birthday cards and Christmas notes, until Mom had gotten good enough at it to fool bank employees who processed dozens of loans daily and never looked closely. Ava explained my options with the careful tone of someone laying out paths through a minefield. I could walk away, let the house foreclose, and wash my hands of the whole situation. It would tank their credit, but leave mine recoverable once the fraud disputes were processed. I could pay off the debt they'd accumulated in my name and claim my 30% ownership, essentially buying into a property I'd already saved once before. Or I could press charges for fraud and forgery, and if convicted, they'd likely lose the house entirely in the legal fallout, potentially leaving me to claim full ownership of a property built on my money and their crimes. Each option carried moral weight that felt like stones in my chest. I sat in Ava's office as evening fell outside her windows, streetlights flickering on one by one, and tried to imagine any version of this that didn't leave someone destroyed. Ava must have seen the paralysis in my face because she leaned forward and said quietly, almost gently, "Nadia, you could sue your own mother for fraud and you'd win. The evidence is overwhelming. The question you need to answer isn't whether you'd win. The question is, do you want justice or do you want peace?" I looked at her and realized I didn't know the answer, didn't even know if there was a difference anymore between justice and peace, or if choosing one meant forever losing the other. I didn't have to wait long for their response to the legal letters. Mom called 4 days after Ava sent the cease and desist notifications, her timing calculated for maximum impact. It was 8 in the evening, late enough that she knew I'd be home early enough that Ethan would still be awake to potentially overhear. I almost didn't answer my finger hovering over the decline button, but some old instinct made me pick up. Her voice came through syrupy sweet, at first the tone she used when she wanted something and thought charm would work better than demands. "Nadia, honey, I think there's been some kind of mistake with the bank. The mortgage payment didn't go through this month and they're calling us about it. Can you check your account? Maybe it's just a technical issue." She said it like we were discussing a minor inconvenience, like the payment had simply gotten lost in cyberspace, rather than deliberately canceled by me. There was no acknowledgement of Christmas, no mention of the forged signatures Ava had documented, no apology for anything. Just the assumption that I would fix this like I'd fixed everything else for the past 15 years. "It's not a mistake, Mom," I said, keeping my voice level. "I canceled all the automatic payments. I'm not making them anymore." The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but I could hear the gears shifting in her head, recalibrating from sweet to sharp. When she spoke again, the sugar was gone from her voice. "What do you mean you're not making them anymore? The mortgage is due, Nadia. You need to pay it like you always do. We can't lose this house." The entitlement in that statement was so pure it almost made me laugh. Not a request, not an acknowledgement of the years I'd been paying, just a command based on the assumption that my money was theirs by right. "I know you can't lose the house," I said. "That's why you'll need to make the payment yourselves." "After everything we've done for you." Her voice rose rage, replacing manipulation when manipulation failed. "We raised you, we fed you, we gave you a roof over your head, and this is how you repay us, by abandoning us when we need you most." The words should have made me feel guilty, should have triggered that old familiar shame that had controlled me for decades. Instead, I felt something crystallize inside me, a clarity I'd never quite achieved before. "Did you?" I asked, and my voice was steady, almost curious. Did you give me a roof? Or did I pay for that roof with the $47,000 I gave you in 2020? The silence on the other end was absolute deafening in its totality. I'd never directly challenged her narrative before, never pointed out the obvious discrepancy between her version of events and reality. She had no script for this moment, no prepared response for a daughter who finally asked questions instead of just apologizing. Before she could recover, I heard scuffling on the other end, the phone being grabbed, and then Jess's voice came through sharp and accusing. "You're really going to do this? You're really going to let Mom and Dad lose their house? I have kids, Nadia. They need their grandparents home for the holidays. They need stability and family traditions." The hypocrisy was so stunning it took my breath away. Her kids needed their grandparents home for holidays, but my son wasn't allowed through the door. Her children deserved stability, but mine deserved to wait in a cold car. "Jess," I said. And I could hear something new in my own voice, something hard and unyielding. "Why was Ethan not allowed inside on Christmas?" She didn't even hesitate, didn't try to soften it or pretend she didn't know what I was talking about. "Because he makes everything awkward, Nadia. He's always sick, always needing attention, always needy. It ruins the mood. The holidays are supposed to be fun, not depressing." The words came out casual, matter-of-fact, like she was explaining why you wouldn't bring a wet dog to a dinner party. My son's chronic illness, his weak heart, his very existence was a mood killer to be excluded for everyone else's comfort. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, not because it was exceptional, but because it was so casual. This was how they really saw him, saw us. We were inconvenient, uncomfortable, too real for the perfect family performance they wanted to maintain. The mask hadn't slipped, it had been ripped away entirely, and what was underneath was exactly what I'd always suspected, but never let myself fully acknowledge. "You raised Jess to depend on everyone but herself," I said, my voice steady, despite the fury building in my chest. "You raised me to accept being erased. I'm done with both lessons." Mom grabbed the phone back, and I heard her breathing hard, working herself up to her final attack. "If you stop paying, you stop being our daughter. Do you understand me? You walk away from this family. You're walking away forever. There's no coming back from this, Nadia." She meant it as a threat, as the ultimate weapon that would bring me to heel. But something had broken free inside my chest, something that had been trapped there for 45 years. It wasn't pain breaking free, it was the absence of pain, the release of finally not caring whether she loved me or not. "I stopped being your daughter the day you made me choose between my son's dignity and your approval," I said, and my voice didn't shake at all. "I choose him. I will always choose him." I hung up before she could respond, before she could deploy whatever final manipulation she'd been preparing. My hands were shaking, but not from fear or doubt. I was shaking from the adrenaline of finally saying what needed to be said. Ethan appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, his face uncertain. "Was that Grandma?" he asked quietly. "Yes, baby. That was Grandma." "Are you okay?" I looked at my son, at his worried face and his two old eyes, and I realized I was more than okay. I was free. "Yeah, honey. I'm okay. We're both okay." 2 hours later, my phone started buzzing with notifications. I knew before I looked what it would be, knew Mom's playbook well enough to predict her next move. Sure enough, there it was on Facebook, posted for maximum visibility and sympathy. "Betrayed by those you sacrifice everything for. Some children forget the 5th commandment." She'd added a broken heart because of course she had. The comments were already rolling, and the same people who'd supported her before offering prayers and outrage at the unnamed but obvious villain. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I turned off my phone and didn't turn it back on until morning. The silence after that phone call was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. For the first time in 15 years, my phone wasn't ringing with emergencies that needed my immediate financial intervention. My bank account sat untouched by automatic withdrawals I'd set up so long ago I'd stopped noticing them. February turned into March, and I watched from a distance as the house of cards I'd been holding up with my own exhausted hands finally began to collapse under its own weight. I didn't have to imagine what was happening at their house, because the evidence started appearing in small ways first. A mutual acquaintance from church mentioned casually that she'd tried to call my parents and their phone just rang without going to voicemail, the kind of endless ringing that meant service had been disconnected. Another friend said she'd stopped by to drop off a casserole and no one answered despite cars being in the driveway, and when she peeked through the front window, the house was dark, even though it was evening. The mortgage I'd been paying went unpaid for the first time in the 5 years since I'd started covering it. Property taxes that were due in January sat unaddressed, accumulating penalties that compounded daily. Utility companies that had never had to send second notices to that address suddenly found themselves sending final warnings. Harold tried to fix it the only way he knew how, which was to get a job. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that he'd applied at the hardware store, at the grocery store, even at the fast food place near the highway. But he was 68 years old with no work history for the past decade, and nobody was interested in hiring someone who would likely need accommodations for age-related limitations and who had no recent references. The rejection must have been devastating for a man who'd spent his retirement assuming money would always appear because it always had before. Jess, who'd never held any job longer than 6 months and had been living off a combination of mom's subsidies and my forged credit, discovered that her mother could no longer fund her lifestyle because her mother had never been funding it in the first place. Margaret, who'd spent decades managing a household budget that existed only because of my invisible contributions, now faced the mathematical reality of their actual income. Harold's Social Security check of $1,800 a month and nothing else. That number had to cover a mortgage payment of $1,200, utilities, food insurance, car payments, and everything else that makes up a life. The house that had seemed so solid, so permanent, had been built entirely on a foundation that was me, and when I removed myself, there was nothing underneath but debt and delusion. Mrs. Bennett became an unexpected chronicler of their decline. The woman who'd spent weeks spreading gossip about my supposed cruelty started documenting what was actually happening 3 doors down from her pristine yard. She sent me an email in mid-March, with photos attached, and a message that was surprisingly direct. "You should see what you're no longer responsible for." I opened the attachments with my heart pounding, not sure what I'd find. The images were startling in their starkness. The front lawn that had always been meticulously maintained now grew wild grass reaching nearly a foot high in some places. Mail overflowed from the mailbox, spilling onto the porch where it sat in rain-damaged piles. Both cars in the driveway had expired registration stickers, one from 4 months ago, one from 6. The HOA had taped violation notices to the front door, bright orange papers that screamed official disapproval. In one photo, I could see through a gap in the curtains to a living room that looked cluttered and dim. Newspapers stacked on surfaces, the general air of abandonment that happens when people stop caring or stop having the energy to pretend. Looking at those photos, I realized something I'd never quite articulated before. My money hadn't just been supporting the house or paying their bills. It had been maintaining an elaborate illusion of a functional family, a carefully constructed facade that everything was fine, that they were respectable middle-class people who had their lives together. Without my financial foundation, the illusion dissolved like sugar in rain, revealing what had always been underneath dysfunction so deep it had its own ecosystem. Harold started calling in early March, and his calls were different from Mom's demands or Jess's accusations. His voice shook when he spoke, and he never asked for money directly. He'd just say things like, "Nadia, I don't know what to do. The electric company sent another notice, and I don't understand what they want me to do. Your mother always handled this, and then you were handling it, and now I just don't know." He'd trail off mid-sentence, leaving thoughts incomplete, revealing the helplessness that had always been at the core of their family system. He'd never learned to manage money because Margaret controlled it all, and she'd never learned to manage it because it had always been my money she was managing. One evening he called and said, "I tried to set up online bill pay like the bank lady suggested, but I can't remember the passwords and the security questions don't make sense, and I just feel so stupid, Nadia. I'm 68 years old and I can't figure out how to pay a bill online." I could hear him crying, this man who'd never shown emotion in my entire childhood, breaking down over something that should have been simple but represented everything he'd never learned, because there had always been someone else to do it for him. I felt pity listening to him, genuine sadness for a man who'd reached retirement age without basic life skills. But the pity wasn't enough to make me return, wasn't enough to make me pick up the burden I'd finally set down. "Dad," I said gently, "you can learn. People learn new things at 68 every day. The library has classes on computer skills. The senior center offers help with bill paying. But I can't learn it for you. That's something you have to do yourself." He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I understand," though I wasn't sure he really did. He hung up without asking me to come back, and I sat there holding my phone, feeling the weight of boundaries that protected me even as they hurt him. 3 days later, a text came through from a number I didn't recognize. No words, just a photo. I opened it and felt my stomach drop, even though I'd known this was coming. A red foreclosure notice, official and stark, taped to my parents' front door for all the neighbors to see. The foreclosure notice going public marked the beginning of Mom's most aggressive campaign yet. If she was going down, she was determined to take my reputation with her. She'd always been skilled at social manipulation, but what she launched in the days after that notice appeared was masterful in its calculation and ruthless in its execution. She started posting daily on Facebook, crafting a narrative of abandonment and cruelty that painted me as the villain in a tragedy she'd been writing for months. Each post was accompanied by carefully selected photos from my childhood images I'd forgotten existed. There was 7-year-old me at my birthday party, smiling at a cake that I now remembered had been divided unfairly. 10-year-old me at Christmas, holding a present that I recalled had been practical socks, while Jess opened toys in the background, carefully cropped out. The captions were devastating in their simplicity, remembering when my daughter still loved her family, and before she decided money was more important than her parents. She wrote long posts about her health problems, some genuine and some exaggerated beyond recognition. A minor arthritis diagnosis became a crippling condition. Her controlled blood pressure became a life-threatening crisis. She described herself as a frail, elderly woman being victimized by a daughter who'd turned cruel and cold, conveniently omitting the 45 years of favoritism and the recent years of financial fraud. The posts got massive engagement from people who knew just enough to be dangerous. The comments section became a Greek chorus of judgment. Children today have absolutely no respect for what their parents sacrificed. I can't imagine abandoning my mother in her time of need. What kind of monster does that, "This is what happens when you raise kids who only care about money"? Each comment was a small knife, and there were hundreds of them. The community fractured along fault lines I hadn't known existed. The older church members, the ones who'd known Margaret for decades and only saw her Sunday performance, sided with her completely. They called me, left voicemails dripping with concern that was really condemnation. Mrs. Patterson, who I'd once admired for caring for her own mother, left a message saying she was praying for my soul and hoping I'd find my way back to honoring my parents before it was too late. Another woman I barely knew sent a text quoting scripture about honoring father and mother, as if Bible verses could shame me back into funding my own erasure. The court of public opinion, at least in the church community, seemed to have rendered its verdict, and I was guilty. But something unexpected was happening simultaneously. Women I'd worked with at Crosscare, women who'd seen me at 3 a.m. with dying patients, started speaking up. They didn't post long defenses or detailed explanations. They just shared simple stories. One wrote about how I'd stayed 16 hours straight with her mother during her final night because the family couldn't get there in time, and how I'd paid for the funeral flowers out of my own pocket when they couldn't afford them. Another shared about the time I'd covered her rent when she was between jobs, never expecting repayment, never mentioning it again. A third talked about how I'd never once in all the years she'd known me said a negative word about my family, despite clearly carrying stress that showed in the lines around my eyes and the exhaustion in my voice. These weren't dramatic defenses or angry rebuttals. They were just truth told quietly by people who'd witnessed my character when no one was watching. Pastor Ruth did something I never expected. She broke her usual policy of staying neutral in family conflicts and posted publicly on the church's Facebook page, "Truth doesn't need witnesses. It stands on its own. But lies need crowds." She didn't name anyone, didn't take sides explicitly, but everyone knew what she meant. The post got shared almost as much as Mom's dramatic accusations, and suddenly, there were two narratives competing for attention instead of just one. The real turning point came from the last place I expected. Ethan's English teacher had assigned an essay about family, and he'd written something he never showed me until after it was published. The teacher had been so moved by it that she'd submitted it to our local community newsletter without telling us, and it ran in the March issue under the title "What Family Means," with my 11-year-old son's name beneath it. A neighbor brought me a copy, and I read it standing in my driveway, tears blurring the words. He'd written about watching me work 3 jobs after his father left, about the night I'd stayed awake for 48 hours straight when his heart was failing and the hospital was full, about the Christmas morning when I'd given him my own breakfast because money had been so tight I'd had to choose between feeding both of us adequately or just feeding him well. He wrote about my hands always moving, always working, always caring for others. And then he wrote the sentence that broke me. "My mom teaches me that love is action, not words. She teaches me to stop apologizing for surviving." The essay got passed around, shared on local Facebook groups, discussed at coffee shops and church gatherings. I started getting messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, people who'd read it and suddenly understood that there might be more to the story than Mom's dramatic posts suggested. The tide wasn't turning completely, but it was shifting, creating eddies and currents that hadn't existed before. Some people were starting to ask questions instead of just accepting the narrative they'd been fed. Then 3 days after Ethan's essay was published, my phone buzzed with a message from Jess. My stomach dropped when I saw her name because I knew whatever was coming wouldn't be good. I opened it and read, "Undo this right now, or I'll reveal your real secret. Everyone will know what kind of mother you really are." My hands went cold. I stared at the screen, trying to understand what secret she thought she had, what weapon she believed she could use against me that would be worse than everything that had already been said. I spent that night trying to figure out what secret Jess thought she had, what ammunition she believed would destroy me more completely than everything that had already been said. The answer came the next morning when my phone started exploding with notifications before I'd even gotten out of bed. Jess had posted publicly, and this time she wasn't hiding behind vague implications. "My sister claims she's struggling financially, but let me tell you what she really did. When her son needed life-saving heart surgery, she refused to pay for it because she was saving for her future. Ask her where her priorities really are when a child's life is on the line. Some mothers don't deserve their children." The post was a tactical nuclear weapon designed for maximum devastation. What kind of mother refuses medical care for her own child? The accusation was so specifically monstrous that people who'd been starting to question Margaret's narrative suddenly had their doubts confirmed. I watched in real time as the post got shared, as comments piled up expressing shock and horror. My phone rang continuously. Ethan's school counselor called asking if we needed to talk. A social worker I'd never heard of called to schedule a wellness check, her voice professionally neutral but clearly concerned. Even people who'd defended me started sending careful messages, "Is this true? There must be an explanation." The lie was working because it contained just enough truth to be believable. Ethan had needed surgery. It had been expensive. And we had struggled. But the framing inverted reality so completely that the truth looked like the lie. I could have responded on social media, could have posted my own defensive explanation with bank statements attached, but I knew that would just make me look desperate. Instead, I did something that terrified me more than any public accusation. I wrote a letter explaining everything and asked Pastor Ruth if she would read it at church that Sunday. I gave her permission to share the full truth, including details I'd kept private for years because I'd been too proud to admit how completely my family had failed me when I'd needed them most. Sunday morning, I sat in the same pew I'd sat in for years with Ethan beside me, holding my hand so tightly my fingers went numb. Pastor Ruth stood at the pulpit with my letter and began reading in her clear, unwavering voice. She told the story I'd written, the one I'd never had the courage to tell publicly. When Ethan was 5 years old, his pediatric cardiologist had discovered that his congenital heart defect required immediate surgery. The cost was $180,000. Insurance would cover $120,000. We needed $60,000 we didn't have. Margaret and Harold had promised to help, had made a grand show at a family dinner about how family takes care of family. How, of course, they'd contribute to their grandson's life-saving surgery. I'd believed them because I desperately needed to believe them. But when I'd called 3 weeks later to confirm their contribution so I could schedule the surgery, Margaret had said the money was tied up in investments that couldn't be liquidated without penalties. She'd promised it would be available in 6 months, maybe a year. Dad had gotten on the line and said essentially the same thing, both of them sorry, but helpless, both of them unable to access funds that I later learned had never existed. I couldn't wait 6 months or a year. Ethan's heart was failing, so I'd taken out a third mortgage on my house, the one I'd already mortgaged twice to save their home. I'd worked night shifts and weekend shifts and every available hour for 18 months straight, sleeping 4 hours a night when I slept at all, existing on coffee and terror, and the singular focus of keeping my son alive. Pastor Ruth's voice wavered slightly as she read the next part, the part that made my own participation in this story almost unbearable to acknowledge. During those same 18 months when I was working myself nearly to death, Jess had posted photos from Cancun, from weekend shopping trips, from expensive restaurants. And I had continued sending money for their family emergencies, continued paying their bills, continued being the invisible foundation, even while building my own son's life from nothing but my own exhausted will. The surgery had happened. Ethan had survived. I'd paid every penny myself, and I'd never told anyone, because admitting it meant admitting that my own parents had chosen vacation photos over their grandson's life. When Pastor Ruth finished reading, the silence in the church was profound. Then I heard crying, soft at first, and then louder. Women I'd known for years were openly weeping. After the service, people approached me, and this time the apologies came with shame in their eyes. They'd believed Jess's lie because it fit the narrative they'd already accepted, and now they had to reckon with how easily they'd participated in crucifying someone whose only crime was finally setting boundaries. Mrs. Bennet approached me outside, and I braced myself for another judgment, another condemnation. Instead, she held out a manila folder thick with papers, her hands shaking slightly. "I've been keeping records," she said quietly. 20 years of records. She explained, her voice catching, that her own daughter had died 15 years ago from injuries sustained in an abusive marriage. Neighbors had witnessed it, had seen the signs, but nobody had reported it. Nobody had intervened. Mrs. Bennet couldn't save her daughter, but she'd been watching me for 2 decades, documenting everything, hoping I'd find the strength to leave before it was too late. She opened the folder and showed me what she'd collected. Dated photographs of Jess's new cars over the years, time-stamped screenshots of vacation posts with price estimates noted in her careful handwriting, printed copies of Margaret's Facebook posts about struggling financially cross-referenced with Jess's posts about luxury purchases from the same weeks. She'd documented the pattern of their lifestyle funded by invisible money, and she'd kept it all as evidence for a moment she'd hoped would come. The church was emptying out around us, and I saw Ethan walking toward me with something in his hands. He'd gone back inside while I was talking to Mrs. Bennet, and now he held a folder of his own, this one containing his medical records from that surgery 6 years ago. He walked past me to the steps of the church, where people were still standing in small groups, and in a voice that carried across the parking lot, my 11-year-old son said clearly and without hesitation, "My mom didn't abandon family. She saved mine." After Ethan's declaration on the church steps, after Mrs. Bennet's folder of evidence, after the community had finally heard the truth, I should have felt vindicated enough to walk away forever. But there was something unfinished, something that gnawed at me in the quiet moments when I wasn't busy defending myself or comforting my son. I needed to look them in the eye one last time, not through the filter of lawyers or social media, not mediated by angry phone calls or text messages. but face to face in the house where I'd learned to make myself small. Ava told me it was a mistake, that I had nothing to gain and everything to lose by giving them another opportunity to hurt me. But this wasn't about gaining anything. It was about closure, about speaking my truth in person, and then being able to walk away knowing I'd said everything that needed to be said. I made the same dishes I'd brought on Christmas Eve, the green bean casserole, and roasted chicken and the dinner rolls that took 3 hours to make from scratch. I wasn't trying to win them over with food, but there was something symbolic about bringing the meal that had been rejected, about offering one more time what had never been accepted. I also brought something new, a printed financial breakdown that Ava had helped me prepare, every payment documented and totaled 15 years of support, reduced to numbers on paper that told a story my family had spent decades denying. When I pulled up to their house in early April, the reality of their situation hit me harder than the photos had suggested. The grass wasn't just overgrown, it was dying in patches, brown spots spreading like disease. The paint on the trim was peeling, and one of the shutters hung at an angle. There was a weariness to everything, a sense of decay that went deeper than financial neglect. This was what happened when the illusion of stability was removed and only the truth remained. Mom answered the door, and for a moment neither of us spoke. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, the lines around her mouth deeper, her eyes carrying an exhaustion that makeup couldn't hide. She didn't refuse me entry, didn't put up a fight, just stepped aside and let me in. Dad was in the living room, sitting in his chair with the television muted, and Jess was on the couch with her phone, though she set it down when she saw me carrying food. I set everything on the dining room table that I'd eaten at thousands of times, the table where I'd learned that my portion would always be smaller, my voice would always matter less. We ate in silence for the first 10 minutes, the tension so thick it was almost a physical presence. Finally, I pulled out the financial documentation and laid it in the center of the table like evidence at a trial. I've paid $312,000 into this family over 15 years. I said, my voice steady and calm. I'm not asking for it back. I'm not here to demand repayment. I just want you to see it, acknowledge it, and stop telling people I abandoned you. This is what I gave. This is what you took. And this is why I can't do it anymore. Mom looked at the papers like they were something toxic, and then she pushed them away with one hand, not even bothering to read them. Money isn't love, Nadia, she said, and her voice carried that familiar dismissive tone I'd heard my entire life. You always were so cold and calculating. You've turned everything into a transaction like we're strangers instead of family. You don't understand what family means because you've never learned how to love without keeping score. The accusation was so perfectly inverted from reality that I almost laughed. I'd kept score because I'd had to, because they'd been stealing from me while telling me I was selfish for noticing. But before I could respond, Jess laughed, and the sound was cruel and sharp, exactly like Mom's. You think money makes you better than us, she said, leaning forward with an expression I recognized from childhood, the look she wore when she knew she had Mom's protection and could say anything without consequences. You think paying bills makes you a good daughter? You think working yourself to death proves something? All it proves is that you're a martyr who can't accept that some of us know how to enjoy life instead of just surviving it. The resentment in her voice was breathtaking because it was so naked, so undisguised. She didn't hate me despite my sacrifices. She hated me because of them. Every dollar I'd paid, every crisis I'd solved, every time I'd saved them from their own choices had been a mirror showing her own inadequacy, and she'd spent years resenting me for making her look bad by comparison. Mom had protected her from consequences, but I'd been the one documenting those consequences by constantly cleaning them up, and Jess hated me for being the evidence of her failure. The argument was escalating, voices rising, and I was about to stand up and leave when Harold did something I'd never seen him do in 45 years. He slammed his hand down on the table so hard the dishes jumped, the sound like a gunshot in the small room. "Stop," he said, and his voice shook, but it was loud, commanding in a way I'd never heard from him. "Just stop. Both of you stop." His hands were trembling where they pressed against the table, and his face had gone pale, almost gray. He looked at Margaret with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between anger and desperation and grief. "She needs to know," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "She's always needed to know, and we've spent 35 years lying to her, and I can't do it anymore." Mom's face drained of what little color it had, her eyes going wide. "Harold, don't," she said, and for the first time in my life, I heard fear in her voice, real fear that wasn't performed for sympathy. "Please don't do this. Not now. Not like this." But Dad kept talking, kept looking at me with eyes that were filling with tears. "Nadia, you're not—" He stopped, gathered himself, tried again. "You're not my biological daughter." The words came out all at once, like he'd been holding them back so long that they'd built up pressure behind his teeth. The room went completely silent. Jess's mouth fell open. Mom put her face in her hands. And I sat there feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath my chair, like I was falling but hadn't hit bottom yet. Harold's voice broke completely as he continued, tears running down his face unchecked. "Your mother had you before we met. She was 19 alone and her family had disowned her. I married her, to save you. And I tried for 35 years to love you the same as I loved Jess. But I failed, Nadia. God help me, I failed." The words hung in the air like something physical and dangerous, and I couldn't quite process them. Not his biological daughter. The phrase kept repeating in my head, but it wouldn't connect to meaning, wouldn't translate into something I could understand. I looked at Mom, whose face was still buried in her hands, and then back at Dad, whose tears were falling onto the table between us, and I heard myself ask the simplest question I could form. "What do you mean?" Mom lifted her face then, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Not the manipulative tears she'd deployed so effectively over the years, but genuine anguish, raw and unfiltered. Her voice shook when she spoke, and the story came out in fragments, pieces of a past she'd spent 35 years trying to bury. She was 19 years old when she met Daniel Cross, a man passing through town who'd stayed just long enough to get her pregnant and then disappeared. Her family was deeply religious, the kind of religion that valued appearances above grace, and when she'd told them she was pregnant, they'd called her a whore. Actually called her that, her own mother using that word like a knife. They'd given her a choice: give up the baby for adoption, and never speak of it again, or leave and never come back. She'd chosen to leave because she couldn't bear the thought of handing me over to strangers, but leaving meant she had nothing. She gave birth to me alone in a charity hospital, held me for a few hours, and then watched as a social worker took me away because she had no home to bring me to. For 2 weeks, infant me was in foster care, while Margaret lived in a homeless shelter trying to figure out how a 19-year-old with no education and no family could possibly raise a baby. Harold had been a family friend, 3 years older and steady in ways that must have seemed like salvation. He'd heard what happened through the church gossip network, and he'd shown up at that shelter with an offer that saved both our lives. He would marry her, claim me as his, give us his name and his respectability. It was an act of genuine kindness, and Margaret had accepted it because she had no other choice. When Jess was born, Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper, she was Harold's, really truly his, not claimed, not adopted, not a mercy child, but his biological daughter, and that meant we were finally a real family, not one built on my shame and his pity. She looked at me with eyes that were red and swollen, and I saw decades of complicated emotion I'd never been equipped to recognize. Every time I looked at you, Nadia, I saw my failure. I saw everything I'd done wrong, every choice that had led to being called a whore by my own mother, every night I'd spent in that shelter, terrified that I'd lose you. Jess was my redemption. She was proof that I wasn't just the girl who got pregnant and trapped a good man into saving her. She was proof I could do something right. The explanation was so twisted and so heartbreaking that I didn't know how to respond. She hadn't treated me terribly because I was worthless. She'd treated me terribly because I was a mirror reflecting back her own shame, and she'd spent 35 years trying to break that mirror so she wouldn't have to see what was in it. Harold spoke then, his voice heavy with a pain that sounded like it had been accumulating for decades. And I let her do it because I was angry too. I never admitted it even to myself, but I was angry that I'd saved you both, and never felt like a real father to you. You looked like him, not me. You had his eyes, his chin. Every time someone said you didn't look like me, it was a reminder that I'd married a woman who'd loved someone else, that I was raising another man's child. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. I tried to love you the same. I swear I tried. But there was always this distance, this barrier I couldn't cross, and instead of fighting through it, I just let it be there. I failed you, and I've known it for 35 years, and I'm so sorry. The room was silent except for the sound of Mom crying, and then there was a knock at the door. Harold stood wiping his eyes and came back a moment later with Pastor Ruth behind him. She looked around at all of us, at the tear-stained faces, and the barely touched food, and the papers scattered on the table, and said quietly, "Harold called me an hour ago and asked me to come. He thought you might need someone here who wasn't bleeding from these wounds." I looked at Pastor Ruth and felt something like betrayal flicker in my chest. "You knew?" I asked. "You knew this whole time?" She nodded slowly, her expression sad but unsurprised by my reaction. "Harold came to me 35 years ago before he married your mother. He was young and scared and asking if he was doing the right thing. I counseled him, prayed with him. I told him that love could grow where it was planted with intention, that family was made of choices as much as blood. And then I watched for 3 decades as he tried, and your mother punished you for being the evidence of her past." She turned to Margaret, her voice gentle but firm. "You didn't punish Nadia for your past, Margaret. You punished her for surviving it better than you did. She carried your shame and turned it into strength. She built a life from nothing just like you had to, but she did it without becoming cruel. And that made her a mirror you couldn't bear to look into." Margaret made a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp, and Jess, who had been sitting frozen throughout this entire revelation, finally spoke. "So you mean she's not even really my sister?" The words came out sharp, almost triumphant, like this explained everything and absolved her of all the cruelty she'd shown me over the years. Pastor Ruth looked at Jess with an expression of deep disappointment. "She's been more family to you than you've been to her blood or not. That's what you should be asking yourself. Not whether you're related by DNA, but whether you've earned the right to call her sister." I stood up then because I couldn't sit anymore, couldn't breathe in that room full of confessions that were supposed to explain everything, but actually explained nothing that mattered. "Thank you," I said, and my voice was steady despite the tears running down my face. "Thank you for finally telling me why I was never enough. Why I was always the one who had to be more mature, more understanding, more willing to sacrifice. Thank you for explaining that it wasn't about me at all, it was about your shame and your anger and your resentment of a baby who didn't ask to be born." I picked up my purse, left the food on the table, left the financial papers scattered like evidence at a crime scene. But knowing why doesn't undo 35 years of being treated like I was worthless. It doesn't give me back my childhood or my self-esteem or the decades I spent thinking there was something fundamentally wrong with me. It just means I know whose fault it really was. I walked toward the door and none of them tried to stop me. I walked out of that house knowing I'd never walk back in, at least not as a daughter seeking approval from parents who'd spent 35 years making me pay for sins I didn't commit. The revelation about my biological father should have changed everything, but somehow it changed nothing at all. I'd been unloved before I knew why, and now I just had a reason that made the math of my childhood finally add up. 2 weeks later, Ava called and said I needed to come to the house one more time. "The foreclosure is happening today," she said, "and you need to be there. Trust me on this." Her tone told me there was something she wasn't saying, something I needed to see for myself. When I pulled up to the house in late April, 6 months after I'd canceled that first payment, the street was lined with cars. Neighbors had gathered, some standing in clusters on their lawns, some sitting in lawn chairs like they were watching a parade. A county sheriff's vehicle was parked in the driveway, and a moving truck idled at the curb. The scene had the feeling of a public execution, and I suppose in a way it was. The death of an illusion performed for an audience that had believed in it for decades. Margaret was on the front porch screaming at two deputies who stood with the patience of people who'd done this many times before. Her voice was raw words tumbling over each other in a stream of rage and desperation, directed at everyone and no one. Jess stood nearby, filming everything on her phone, already documenting her victimhood for whatever social media post would come next, her face arranged in an expression of tragic dignity. Harold sat on the front steps, with his head in his hands, and he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, diminished in a way that went beyond just age. He wasn't fighting or screaming or filming. He was just sitting there accepting what was coming because he'd known it was coming for months. I got out of my car and Ethan followed me, staying close to my side. Ava appeared from somewhere in the crowd and guided me toward the sheriff, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a name tag that read Tim Morrison. He saw me approaching and his face registered recognition. "Ms. Cross," he said, and I nodded. "I need you to sign these papers. As a partial owner of the property, you have certain legal rights in foreclosure proceedings." He handed me a clipboard with official documents, and I started reading through them, trying to understand what I was signing and why my presence was required. Tim leaned closer and said quietly, so only Ava and I could hear, "Your father filed a quitclaim deed 2 weeks ago. He transferred his 70% ownership to you. Combined with the 30% you already own, this house is entirely yours now." The words took a moment to land to translate into meaning. The house was mine. Harold had signed over his portion without telling anyone, without asking for anything in return, his final attempt at making amends for 35 years of failing to be the father he'd promised to be. I looked past Tim to where Harold sat on the steps, and our eyes met. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and then looked away. Margaret's scream cut through the air. "What? What did you just say?" She'd heard Tim's quiet explanation, or maybe she'd just seen my face change. She turned on Harold with a fury that made the deputies step closer, hands moving instinctively toward their belts. "You did what? You gave her the house. This is my house. I've lived here for 30 years. Harold finally looked up at her, and his voice was tired but steady. "I'm giving her what she paid for Margaret. She saved this house once. She paid for it more than we ever did. It's hers." Tim turned back to me, his expression professional but not unkind. "Ma'am, as the sole owner, you have the legal right to allow the current occupants to remain or to authorize their removal. It's your decision." Every eye on that street turned toward me. Neighbors who'd gossiped about my cruelty now watched to see what I'd do with absolute power over the people who'd made my life a lesson in endurance. Jess stopped filming and stepped forward, her phone lowering for the first time. "Nadia, please," she said, and her voice cracked in a way that might have been genuine or might have been performance. "We'll have nowhere to go. I have kids. Please don't do this." Margaret said nothing, her face frozen in an expression somewhere between rage and shock, like she couldn't quite process that the power dynamic had shifted so completely. I looked at Harold, who was watching me with resignation, accepting whatever judgment I delivered. I looked at Jess, who was pleading now, tears running down her face. I looked at the neighbors, at Mrs. Bennett standing in her yard with her arms crossed, at the deputies waiting for my decision, at the house itself that had never been a home to me, but had been the stage for every humiliation I'd endured. Then I looked at Ethan standing beside me, holding my hand, watching to see what his mother would do with the power to hurt people who'd hurt her. This was the lesson I'd teach him right now, in this moment. Would I teach him that revenge was sweet, or would I teach him something harder and more true? I spoke clearly, loudly enough that everyone could hear. I stopped saving people who refused to swim on their own. I took the pen from Tim and signed the authorization for the eviction to proceed. My signature was steady, no hesitation, no doubt. Margaret made a sound like something had broken inside her chest and sank to her knees on the porch, not in performance this time, but in genuine collapse. Harold nodded. slowly, stood up and walked toward Jess's car without looking back at the house. Jess's face transformed from pleading to fury in an instant. "You wanted this to happen!" She screamed at me, her phone up and filming again, capturing what she'd spin into her next victim narrative. "You planned this! You've been waiting for this!" I looked at her directly, at this woman who'd spent our entire lives taking everything and learning nothing. "No, Jess, I didn't want this. I just stopped preventing it. There's a difference." The movers began carrying furniture out, and Margaret had to be helped to her feet by one of the deputies. Jess got her into the car, still filming, still narrating her tragedy for whatever audience would listen. As they pulled away from the curb, Margaret turned in the passenger seat and looked back at me through the window. Our eyes met, and she mouthed something I could just barely make out. Not an apology, not a curse, but a recognition. "You're stronger than I ever was. That's why I hated you." Then the car turned the corner, and they were gone, and I was standing in front of a house that was finally legally, completely mine. The house sat empty for a week, while I decided what to do with a property I'd paid for 3 times over but had never wanted to own. I walked through rooms that held 45 years of memories, most of them painful, and tried to figure out what healing looked like when it was built on the ruins of someone else's collapse. I was sorting through the contents Mom had left behind, boxing up items for donation, when my phone rang with Jess's number. I almost didn't answer, had my finger hovering over decline, but something made me pick up. Her voice came through frantic and breathless in a way I'd never heard before. "Nadia, Mom, collapsed. We're at County General and she's not conscious, and they're saying something about her heart, and I don't have insurance, I don't have money, they're going to stabilize her and discharge her to the street, and I don't know what to do." The words tumbled out without pause, genuine terror replacing the usual entitlement. This wasn't manipulation or performance. This was my sister confronting the reality that our mother might die in a cheap motel room because the safety net I'd provided for years no longer existed. I should have felt satisfaction, some sense of karmic justice being served. Instead, I felt tired and sad and faced with a choice that would define who I was going to be for the rest of my life. I could match their cruelty with my own, could let Mom face the consequences of a lifetime of choices without my interference. Or I could be someone different, someone who helped not because it was deserved, but because I had the capacity and chose to use it. "What hospital?" I asked, and I heard Jess exhale in relief and surprise. When I arrived at County General, I found Jess in the waiting room with her 3 children, all of them looking exhausted and scared. Mom was in the cardiac unit stable but being monitored. The episode hadn't been a full heart attack, but it had been serious enough to require immediate intervention and ongoing care. The social worker explained that without insurance and without proof of income, Margaret would be discharged within 48 hours, regardless of whether she had somewhere safe to go. The bill so far was $18,000, and they'd need a payment plan or proof of Medicaid eligibility before they could discuss any kind of follow-up care. I thought about the money I'd found while clearing out the house, the stash Margaret had hidden in an old sewing box in the back of her closet. $4,000 in cash carefully squirreled away over years while she was claiming poverty and demanding I pay her bills. I'd been planning to donate it or use it for the house repairs, but there was a poetic justice in using her own secret savings to save her life. I paid the hospital bill with a combination of that cash and my own money, enough to clear the immediate debt and arrange for Mom to be transferred to a cardiac recovery facility. Not a luxury rehab center, but a clean, safe place that accepted Medicare and charity cases, where she could recover for 2 weeks while figuring out her next steps. Jess watched me handle the paperwork with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and confusion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly while her kids were distracted with vending machine snacks I'd bought them. "After everything we did after we treated you like garbage, why are you helping?" I looked at her and tried to find words that were true without being cruel. "I'm helping because I cannot, because she's earned it. There's a difference." I signed the final form and handed it to the social worker. "After 2 weeks, she'll need to apply for Medicaid like millions of other elderly Americans." I'm giving her time to figure that out, but I'm not providing a permanent solution. That's something she'll have to do herself. When Mom was stable enough for visitors, I went to her room alone. She looked small in the hospital bed, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with her physical size. The monitors beeped steadily, tracking a heart that had been under stress for longer than just this crisis. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, she spoke, her voice rough from the breathing tube they'd had to use. "I should have died in that motel," she said, and it wasn't self-pity so much as statement of fact. "But you didn't," I responded, keeping my voice level. "And now you have a choice about what you do with the life you still have." She turned her head to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not manipulation, not performance, but genuine questioning. "Can you ever forgive me?" she asked. "For all of it. For treating you like you didn't matter, for punishing you, for existing, for being so broken that I broke you too." I thought about lying about giving her the absolution she was asking for because it would be easier. But I'd spent 45 years making things easier for other people at my own expense, and I was done with that version of mercy. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know if I can forgive what you did or if forgiveness is even the right word for what we need. But I can stop letting your choices define mine. I can stop carrying your shame like it was mine to carry. I can help you now without pretending the past didn't happen." It wasn't the tearful reconciliation scene you see in movies where the music swells and everyone hugs and all wounds are healed by acknowledgement. It was just two damaged people sitting in a hospital room, acknowledging reality without trying to pretty it up or make it something it wasn't. Mom closed her eyes and I thought she might be done talking, but then she said quietly, "You're a better person than I ever was. I'm glad you didn't learn how to love from me." Pastor Ruth came that evening, called by Jess, who was smart enough to know we needed a mediator. She sat with both of us and said something that I've thought about every day since. "Mercy is not weakness, Nadia. It's the end of the chain. Your mother learned cruelty from her parents, who learned it from theirs, generations of people passing down wounds like family heirlooms. You're choosing to break that pattern to let the chain end with you, instead of passing it on to Ethan. That's the bravest thing a person can do." I left the hospital that night feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not peace, exactly, but maybe the possibility of peace somewhere in the future. I'd helped without rescuing, showed mercy without reconciling, set boundaries that protected me while still acknowledging Mom's humanity. It felt like the right kind of strength, the kind that didn't require cruelty to prove itself. 2 days later, I was making breakfast when someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find Jess standing there, and my first thought was that Mom had taken a turn for the worse. But Jess's face showed a different kind of devastation. Her mascara was running, her eyes were red and swollen, and when she spoke, her voice broke on every word. "They took my kids. CPS took my kids." I stood in my doorway looking at Jess, who was shaking so hard I thought her legs might give out. I stepped aside and let her in, not because I'd forgiven her, but because whatever had happened was clearly devastating enough to strip away every defense she'd ever had. She collapsed onto my couch, and the story came out in broken pieces between sobs. After the eviction, she'd been living motel to motel with her 3 children, staying in whatever cheap place would take cash and not ask questions. When the money ran out, they'd spent nights in her car, parked in different locations so no one would notice. She'd been going to job interviews during the day, sometimes leaving the kids alone in motel rooms with instructions to stay quiet and not answer the door. At night, when the walls closed in and the reality of her situation became unbearable, she'd leave them sleeping and go to bars anywhere she could escape for a few hours and pretend her life wasn't falling apart. Someone had been watching. Multiple motel clerks had called to report children left unsupervised crying in rooms, asking strangers for food. A social worker had been building a case for weeks, documenting each incident, each sign of neglect. Yesterday morning, CPS had arrived at the motel with police escort and removed all 3 children. Emma, who was 4, had screamed for Jess. Tyler, who was 6, had gone silent and compliant in that way children do when they're too scared to protest. Madison, who was 8, had packed her own bag and helped her younger siblings pack theirs, already understanding that this was serious and permanent unless something changed. They were in temporary foster care now, placed with a family Jess had never met, and she had 30 days to prove she could provide stable housing, steady employment, and appropriate childcare. If she failed, the state would move toward permanent termination of her parental rights. "I don't know what to do," Jess said, her voice raw. "I've never had a real job, never kept an apartment without someone co-signing, never done any of this on my own. Mom always fixed everything, and then you were fixing everything, and now there's nobody, and I'm going to lose my kids." The terror in her voice was genuine, stripped of the entitlement I'd heard from her my entire life. This was rock bottom, the place where consequences finally caught up with years of enabling. I picked up my phone and called the CPS caseworker, whose name Jess had given me, needing to understand the full situation before I decided whether to help or walk away. The woman who answered was professional, but warm, clearly someone who'd been doing this work long enough to see patterns but still cared about the individuals caught in them. She explained the case, the timeline of reports, the requirements Jess would need to meet. And then she told me something that made me sit down hard in my kitchen chair. "The original complaint came from Margaret Cross," she said. "Your mother called us 2 months ago before the eviction, before the hospitalization. She reported that her daughter was neglecting the children, that she'd enabled that neglect for years, and that the grandchildren were paying the price for both their failures." The caseworker's voice softened. She said, and I wrote this down because it struck me, "I can't fix it anymore, but maybe you can. Please help them before I've destroyed another generation." Mom had called CPS on her own daughter, on the golden child she'd protected and enabled for 33 years. It was an act of clarity that must have cost her everything she'd built her identity on, admitting that her favoritism had created a woman incapable of basic parenting, that her protection had actually been harm. When I told Jess, watching her face as she processed, that her mother had been the one to report her, I saw something break and something else begin to form in the space that breaking created. "She knew," Jess whispered. "She knew I couldn't do it, and instead of fixing it like she always did, she called them." There was devastation in her voice, but also something that might have been the beginning of understanding. I sat across from my sister and made a decision that surprised both of us. "I'll help you get your children back," I said, and I saw hope flash across her face before I continued. "But not by giving you money or making calls or solving your problems for you. I'll help you become someone who can keep them. That's different from what you've gotten your whole life, and it's going to be harder." I outlined the conditions with Ava's help over the phone, making them clear and non-negotiable. Jess would complete court-mandated parenting classes and attend therapy twice a week to address whatever had made her think leaving small children alone was acceptable. She would find a job, any job, and keep it for at least 6 months, proving she could show up consistently. She would live in a supervised transitional housing program I'd help her apply for, where caseworkers would monitor her progress and teach her basic life skills she'd never learned. I would co-sign for an apartment after those 6 months if she'd met every requirement, and I would provide childcare during her work hours once she got the kids back. But if she failed any requirement, if she lied or took shortcuts or fell back into old patterns, I would walk away permanently and let the state handle it. "Why would you help me after everything I've done?" Jess asked, and her voice was small and genuinely confused. "I was horrible to you. I laughed when Mom treated you like garbage. I stole from you and lied about you and tried to destroy your reputation. Why would you give me another chance?" I looked at her and saw not the sister who'd tormented me, but the woman Mom had created by loving her wrong. "Because those kids deserve a mother who tries," I said. "And you deserve one chance to become her, not for my sake and not even really for yours, for them." The apartment I co-signed for was in a complex that had seen better days, but was clean and safe, with a playground where Jess's kids could play once she got them back. She moved in with nothing but trash bags full of clothes and a determination that looked fragile enough to shatter at the first real challenge. I'd arranged for her to start at Crosscare in the most entry-level position we had, the kind of work that required showing up on time and following instructions, but didn't demand skills she didn't have yet. She cleaned examination rooms, restocked supplies, answered phones, and scheduled appointments. For someone who'd spent her entire life believing she was destined for something better than manual labor, it was humbling in ways I watched play out across her face every day. The first month she complained about everything. The work was beneath her, the pay was insulting, the other employees treated her like she didn't matter. I listened without sympathy and reminded her that this was what accountability looked like, that nobody owed her respect she hadn't earned. She attended her court-mandated parenting classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, sitting with other mothers who'd had their children removed, learning basic concepts like age-appropriate discipline and the importance of routine. On Saturdays, she went to therapy with a counselor who specialized in family dysfunction and didn't let her blame everyone else for her choices. The second month, the complaints stopped. She'd come home from work exhausted and silent, processing something she couldn't quite articulate. I'd check in and she'd just nod, say it was fine, go to bed early, and wake up to do it again. By the third month, something had shifted in a way I hadn't expected. She started talking about her clients at Crosscare with genuine concern, asking me questions about dementia care and end-of-life comfort measures. One evening, she told me about Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman whose family never visited, and how she'd stayed 20 minutes past her shift just sitting with her because the loneliness in that woman's eyes reminded Jess of something she was finally starting to understand. "I think I've been lonely my whole life," she said quietly. "Even when Mom was giving me everything, I was lonely, because none of it was real." The setback came in month 4, exactly when people who study addiction and behavioral change say setbacks usually come. Jess's ex-boyfriend Marcus showed up at Crosscare, the father of her youngest child, who'd been absent for 3 years. He was full of promises about wanting to help, about having money saved up, about being ready to be a real father this time. I found out about it when I saw a bank deposit slip on her counter for $200 in cash, dated the day after Marcus appeared. When I asked her about it, she lied, said it was a bonus from work. I called her supervisor and confirmed no bonuses had been issued. The confrontation happened in my living room with both of us standing because sitting felt too casual for what needed to be said. "You just proved you'll still take shortcuts when they're offered," I told her, keeping my voice level. "Marcus has never kept a promise in his life, and you took his money knowing you'd have to lie to me about it. That's the old pattern, Jess. That's who you were before your kids were taken away." She broke down then, not in manipulation but in genuine despair. "I'm terrified," she sobbed. "I'm terrified of doing this alone, terrified I'm going to fail, terrified that even if I do everything right, it won't be enough. And when Marcus showed up with money, it felt like maybe I wouldn't have to be so scared anymore." I sat down next to her and let her cry for a while before I responded. "One more lie, one more shortcut, and I'm done. Your children deserve better than someone who can't tell the truth, even when the truth is hard." It was the kind of tough love she'd never received, boundaries with real consequences, instead of threats that were never enforced. The breakthrough came in month 6. And it came from a place I hadn't anticipated. Jess had completed her parenting classes, had maintained her job for half a year, had attended every therapy session without missing one. But what told me the change was real was when she came to me with a community college catalog and said she wanted to enroll in evening accounting courses. Nobody had suggested it. Nobody had pushed her toward it. She just wanted to prove to herself that she could learn something difficult, that she was capable of more than she'd been told her whole life. "I've been the golden child for 33 years, she said, sitting at my kitchen table with the course catalog open between us. "And I don't even know who I am without someone handing me things. Without Mom telling me I'm special, without you paying for everything, without men promising to take care of me. I need to find out who I am when I'm just me, doing the work, earning what I have." It was the first time I'd heard her take full ownership of her life without blaming or expecting or demanding. This was the moment her redemption became real, when it stopped being something imposed from outside and became something she wanted for herself. Even Ethan noticed. He'd been watching Jess's transformation from a careful distance, protective of me, but curious about whether people could really change. One evening while doing homework at my table, he said casually, "Aunt Jess asked me about my heart surgery today." Like really asked. She wanted to know what it felt like and if I was scared. Nobody ever asks me that. 2 weeks later, my phone rang with the CPS caseworker's number. My heart jumped because I'd learned that calls from her could go either way. "Ms. Cross has completed all court-ordered requirements," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "We're recommending graduated reunification starting next week." The reunification process started slowly with supervised visits twice a week, where Jess could see her children in a neutral setting with a caseworker present. By October, the kids were doing overnight stays at her apartment, and by November they were back home full-time with monthly check-ins to ensure stability continued. Watching Jess with her children during those months showed me a version of my sister I'd never seen before. She was patient when Emma had tantrums, consistent with Tyler's bedtime routine, attentive when Madison talked about school. She wasn't perfect, but she was present in a way she'd never been when Mom had been there to take over whenever parenting got difficult. Around the same time, I started noticing that Jess was disappearing on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, the same nights she used to have parenting classes. When I asked casually where she was going, she'd say she was running errands or meeting a friend, answers that were vague enough to make me curious, but not concerned. I'd learned to respect the boundaries of our new relationship, to not interrogate or monitor her every move like she was still on probation. She was building a life that was hers, and part of my job was to step back and let her build it without my constant supervision. The secret came out by accident in early December when I needed someone to cover an evening shift at Crosscare and called Jess hoping she might be available. There was a long pause on the phone before she said, "I can't. I have class." Another pause. "Accounting class? I've been going twice a week since September. I wanted to finish the certification program before I told anyone because I was afraid I might fail, and then everyone would be right about me not being able to stick with anything." Her voice was uncertain, vulnerable in a way that made me realize how much courage it had taken for her to pursue something without the safety net of anyone knowing. She'd been managing her own expectations, holding herself accountable without external pressure, and that shift from needing others to monitor her to monitoring herself was maybe the biggest change of all. 2 weeks later, she told me she'd applied for an entry-level accounting position at Fisher & Associates, a small local firm that handled taxes and bookkeeping for area businesses. It wasn't connected to me, or Crosscare wasn't a favor called in or a reference leveraged. It was just Jess, her incomplete certification, and her 6 months of employment history competing against other candidates who probably had more education and better credentials. The interview was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon, and I could see her nervousness that morning when she dropped the kids at my house for after-school care. She was wearing clothes I'd helped her pick out from a thrift store, professional but modest, and she looked terrified and determined in equal measure. That evening when she picked up the kids, I asked how it went. She sat down at my kitchen table and told me about the interview in detail, how they'd asked standard questions about her experience and skills, and then the managing partner had asked why they should hire her over other candidates with more traditional backgrounds. "I told him the truth," she said, looking at me with eyes that were clear and steady. "I said I spent 30 years believing the world owed me something and I was wrong. I told him I have 6 months of proof that I can show up every day, work hard, even when it's difficult, and keep learning, even when I'm scared. I said I won't be your best employee on day 1, but I promise I'll be better every month after that, because growth is the only thing I know how to do now." The vulnerability and self-awareness in that answer was so different from the entitled confidence she'd carried her whole life that I felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't the sister who'd laughed while Mom erased me. This was someone new, someone who'd been forced to look at herself honestly and had chosen to become different rather than just pretend the past hadn't happened. 3 days later, on a Saturday morning, Jess called me crying, and I felt my stomach drop, assuming the worst. "I got it," she sobbed. "They offered me the job, $42,000 a year with benefits. It's mine, Nadia. I earned it." When she came over that afternoon to tell me in person with the offer letter in her hands, like proof of something she still couldn't quite believe, I hugged her for the first time in years. Really hugged her, not the awkward, obligatory embraces at holidays, but a genuine embrace between sisters who'd survived something together. "You did this," I said into her hair. "Not me, not Mom, not anyone else. You." That night after the kids were in bed at her apartment, my phone rang with Jess's number. "I'm not calling to thank you," she said when I answered, her voice quiet but certain. "I mean, I am grateful for everything you did, but that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling to say I finally understand what you were trying to teach me. That self-respect comes from doing the work, not from being told you're special. That love isn't someone fixing all your problems, it's someone believing you can fix them yourself." Jess started her new job the following Monday, and I felt a pride that was complicated and earned the kind that comes from watching someone choose to change when change wasn't easy. That same evening, my phone rang with a number I recognized as the cardiac facility where Mom had been living since May. Pastor Ruth's voice came through, gentle but heavy. "Nadia, your mother passed away about an hour ago. It was peaceful. I was with her. She asked me to tell you she was sorry she never learned how to love you right." Mom's death didn't devastate me the way I thought it might, and that realization brought its own complicated grief. I sat with the news for a long time after Pastor Ruth hung up, trying to identify what I felt beneath the numbness. Not relief exactly, but maybe the closing of a chapter I'd been trying to end for a year. The funeral was scheduled for the following Saturday at the church, where she'd performed the role of devoted congregant for 4 decades, and I spent the days leading up to it wondering how many people would come to mourn a woman whose public face had been so different from her private cruelty. The turnout was modest, maybe 30 people scattered across pews that could hold 200. I recognized most of them as longtime church members who showed up for every funeral out of duty rather than personal connection. Mrs. Patterson was there sitting in the back with her daughter. A few women from Mom's Bible study attended, their faces appropriately solemn but not grief-stricken. The people who defended her so vigorously on social media, who'd shared her posts about being abandoned by an ungrateful daughter, were noticeably absent. It was the kind of funeral that revealed the difference between public performance and genuine relationship, and apparently Mom's performances hadn't translated into people who actually mourned her passing. Pastor Ruth delivered a eulogy that was honest in a way that made some people shift uncomfortably in their seats. She didn't sanitize or canonize, didn't pretend Mom had been someone she wasn't. "Margaret struggled with demons that predated any of us," Ruth said, her voice carrying across the quiet church. "Shame, fear, wounds from her own childhood that she never learned to heal. She caused harm particularly to her eldest daughter, and that harm was real and documented and cannot be erased by her death. But in her final months, she found a measure of clarity. She called CPS on her own daughter when that daughter was failing her children. She signed documents releasing Nadia from any remaining legal obligations. She spoke to me about regret and missed chances. These weren't grand redemptive gestures, but they were attempts at repair from someone who had spent a lifetime breaking things. Harold attended in a wheelchair that Jess had borrowed from the hospital, his health having deteriorated rapidly over the past months. He'd moved into a small assisted living facility that accepted Medicaid, a one-room apartment that was all he could afford on Social Security. He held my hand throughout the service, his grip weak but insistent, and when it was over, he looked up at me with tears running down his weathered face. "I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved," he said, his voice shaking. "I was so focused on being seen as a good man, for marrying your mother, for saving her from her circumstances, that I forgot to actually be a good father to you. I let my own resentment poison what could have been love, and I robbed you of something you deserved from the day you were born." Jess had asked if she could say something, and I'd agreed despite not knowing what she planned to say. She stood at the front of the church with a piece of paper she'd written on her hands, trembling as she read. "My mother loved me too much and my sister not enough," she began, and I saw several people glance at me to gauge my reaction. She gave me everything and taught me nothing. She protected me from every consequence and told me I was special enough that rules didn't apply to me. It took losing my children, losing my home, losing everything to learn what she should have taught both of us, that love without accountability isn't love at all. It's just enabling dressed up in affection. Her voice broke on the last words, and when she stepped down from the podium, she came and sat next to me, taking my other hand in hers. Ethan had been quiet throughout the service, sitting on my other side and observing everything with the careful attention he'd learned to give difficult moments. When the service ended and people were filing past the casket to pay final respects, he stood and walked to the front alone. I watched him pull a single white flower from the arrangement I'd ordered, the simple spray of white roses that seemed appropriate for a complicated goodbye. He placed it on the casket and leaned close, whispering something I couldn't hear, but later learned from Pastor Ruth, who was standing nearby. "I forgive you, Grandma. I hope you found peace." As people were leaving, I noticed a man I didn't recognize sitting in the very back pew. He was in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and a face that held something familiar I couldn't quite place. He didn't approach the casket or join the reception line where people were offering me condolences that felt obligatory rather than heartfelt. He just sat there watching, and when our eyes met briefly, he looked away quickly like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. When I looked again a few minutes later, he was gone. Pastor Ruth came to stand beside me as the funeral home staff began preparing to close the casket. "That man in the back," she said quietly. "He was here 3 days ago, too. I saw him sitting in his car outside the church for over an hour. He didn't come in, just sat there looking at the building. I think he's been in town for a while." After everyone had left and the casket had been taken to the cemetery for a brief graveside service that only immediate family attended, I returned home exhausted and numb. Ethan went to his room to do homework, and Jess took her kids back to her apartment, and I sat alone in the living room as evening fell. That's when I noticed the envelope on the hall table placed there by Pastor Ruth, who said she'd found it on the casket after the man had left. My name was written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize, careful and slightly old-fashioned. I opened it with hands that shook for reasons I didn't yet understand, and pulled out a single handwritten letter on lined notebook paper. The first sentence made the room spin around me. "My name is Daniel Cross. I am your father." I read that first sentence 3 times before my brain could process what it meant. Daniel Cross, my biological father. The man whose last name I'd been carrying my entire life without knowing it came from him, not from Harold, who'd claimed me as his own. The letter was 3 pages long, written in careful script that looked like it had been drafted and redrafted many times before he'd settled on this final version. I sat down on the couch and read it slowly, trying to absorb information that recontextualized my entire existence. Daniel explained that he'd left town 35 years ago, not knowing Margaret was pregnant. He was 20 years old, working construction, moving from job to job with the rootlessness of someone who hadn't yet figured out what he wanted from life. He and Margaret had been together briefly, a summer relationship that felt significant at the time, but wasn't built on anything permanent. When the work dried up, he'd left to find employment elsewhere, never knowing that Margaret was carrying his child. 2 years later, when he'd saved enough money to come back and see if there might be something worth returning to, he'd learned that Margaret had married Harold and moved to a different part of town. He'd assumed she'd moved on completely, had built a life with someone else, and he'd respected that enough to stay away. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the baby she'd been raising was his. It wasn't until 10 years ago that a chance conversation with an old mutual friend at a construction conference revealed the truth. The friend had mentioned Margaret Cross said something about her oldest daughter, who didn't look anything like her husband, made a comment about timing that didn't quite add up. Daniel had felt something shift in his understanding of the past, had started asking careful questions, and eventually learned that Margaret had given birth to a daughter 7 months after he'd left town. A daughter who would be 35 years old now, who carried his last name without knowing its origin. He'd hired a private investigator and found me in 2018, learned my address, my occupation, my situation. He'd driven past Crosscare Home Services and seen me through the window helping an elderly client into a car, moving with the careful patience of someone who'd done this work thousands of times. He'd wanted to approach me then to introduce himself and explain everything, but he'd been paralyzed by the fear of disrupting a life that seemed stable, of inserting himself into a story that had been written without him. So he'd watched from a distance for 7 years, making sure I was okay, telling himself he'd reach out when the time was right, but never quite finding the courage. What finally pushed him to come forward was attending Margaret's funeral. He'd felt he owed her that much, owed some acknowledgement of the girl he'd known briefly and left behind regardless of how complicated things had become. He'd sat in the back of the church and watched me throughout the service, observed how I comforted Harold, despite the pain he'd caused, how I held Ethan with fierce protection, how I carried myself with a strength that looked like it had been earned through fire. "I saw my own eyes looking back at me from across the church," he wrote. "The shape of your face, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking. I saw myself in you, and I realized that waiting for the right time was just cowardice disguised as consideration. There's never a right time to tell your daughter you exist, so any time becomes the right time if you're brave enough." The envelope contained photographs tucked into the folded pages. The first was Daniel at 20, and the resemblance was startling enough to make my breath catch. I'd spent my whole life wondering why I didn't look like Harold, internalizing that difference as evidence of not belonging, and here was the answer staring back at me from a faded photo. Same eyes, same chin, same slightly crooked smile. The other photos showed Daniel now at 55, standing in front of a construction site with Cross & Sons Construction on a sign behind him. There were pictures of 2 young men in their 20s, my half-brothers, whose existence I'd never imagined, and a wedding photo of Daniel with a woman whose face held warmth and kindness. She'd passed away 2 years ago from cancer, he explained, but she'd known about me, had encouraged him to reach out. The final part of the letter contained information that made me set the pages down and stare at the wall for several minutes. Daniel had built a successful construction business over the past 3 decades, expanding from solo projects to a company that employed 50 people and took on commercial developments across Colorado. When he'd found me 7 years ago and learned about Ethan's heart condition, about the financial struggles I'd been facing while supporting my entire family, he'd established a trust fund in my name. $500,000 structured to activate only upon Margaret's death, so it wouldn't complicate the already difficult dynamics while she was alive. The fund was accessible now through the attorney whose contact information was included at the bottom of the letter. "I'm not asking to be your father," Daniel wrote in his careful script. "Harold earned that title by raising you whatever his faults or limitations. But I'd like to know you if you'll let me. I'd like to meet my grandson and tell him about the grandfather he never knew and the uncles who'd love to meet him. I'd like to offer you what I should have offered Margaret 35 years ago, present support family that isn't built on obligation, but on choice." I read the final line through tears that had been building since the first page, tears that were complicated and cleansing and somehow right. "You saved her twice, once by being born, when she had nothing else, once by setting her free when staying would have destroyed you both." I sat in my living room holding a letter from a father I'd never known, grieving a mother who'd never loved me right, and feeling something I'd spent 45 years searching for. Not completion exactly, but the beginning of understanding that family was something you built from truth, not something you endured because of blood. I called Daniel 3 days after receiving his letter, my hands shaking as I dialed the number he'd included. We talked for 2 hours, awkward at first, and then easier, filling in decades of blank space with the kind of careful honesty that people use when they're trying not to scare each other away. He lived in Denver, had built Cross & Sons Construction into something substantial, had 2 sons who knew about me and wanted to meet their half-sister. We agreed to take things slowly to let Ethan adjust to the idea of a grandfather who wasn't Harold before planning any visits. The trust fund sat untouched in an account I checked daily just to confirm it was real $500,000 that represented security I'd never imagined having. January brought Jess's final custody hearing, the moment when the court would decide if her 6 months of work had been enough to prove she could parent her children safely. I sat in the gallery with Ethan while Jess sat at a table with her court-appointed attorney looking terrified and determined in a navy dress we'd picked out together. The judge reviewed the case file methodically, asking questions about employment stability, housing arrangements, completion of required programs. Jess answered each question clearly without excuses or deflection, owning her past failures while documenting her present progress. Her supervisor from CrossCare testified about her reliability and growth, noting she'd been promoted to scheduling coordinator after proving herself in entry-level work. Her accounting instructor spoke about her dedication, how she'd stayed after class to ask questions, how she'd earned a B+ in a subject that didn't come naturally. Most surprisingly, 2 of her elderly clients had asked to testify, women in their 80s, who spoke about how gentle Jess was with them, how she listened to their stories, how they'd watched her mature over the months they'd known her. The judge looked at Jess over his reading glasses and said something that made her start crying before he'd even finished. "Ms. Cross, you've done the work. The court is granting full reunification with 6 months of supervision and monthly home visits. Your sister is listed as emergency guardian and primary support person." He paused, his expression stern but not unkind. "Now comes the harder part, sustaining it. This isn't the end of your journey. It's the beginning of proving that change is permanent, not just performance for the court." Jess nodded through her tears, and when we left the courthouse, she hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. Her kids were coming home that weekend, and she was terrified and ready in equal measure. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where everything was magically fixed. It was a realistic new beginning built on accountability and sustained effort, and that made it more valuable than any fantasy. The house sat empty while I figured out what to do with property I'd never wanted but now owned completely. Selling it would have been practical, would have given me money I could use for Ethan's future or my own security. But every time I walked through those rooms, I thought about all the families living in similar dysfunction, all the elderly people being financially abused by the children they'd raised, all the women learning too late that enabling wasn't love. I met with Ava and proposed something that made her smile in that way she had when she thought I was being recklessly idealistic but admired me for it anyway. We'd established the Cross Family Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping elderly individuals achieve financial independence and escape financial abuse. The house would become the physical location offering free financial counseling, legal aid referrals, support groups, and education about recognizing exploitation. The irony wasn't lost on me or anyone else who knew our history. The house that had represented Margaret's kingdom of control, where she'd ruled through guilt and manipulation for decades, would now help others escape exactly that kind of dynamic. We hired a contractor to convert the living spaces into offices and meeting rooms, to make the dining room where I'd learned I was never enough into a conference space where people could learn they were worth protecting. Daniel's construction company did the work at cost, his way of contributing to something that mattered without overstepping the careful boundaries we were establishing. Harold's health continued to decline through the winter, and he moved into Meadowbrook Assisted Living, the same facility where I'd worked as a teenager, learning that my value came from caring for others. I visited him every Wednesday, not out of obligation, but because something had shifted between us after Margaret's death. He'd become humble in his final months, honest about his failures, genuinely proud of what I'd built from the ruins of a childhood he'd failed to protect. "I gave you a last name," he told me one afternoon while we sat in his small room watching snow fall outside. "But you gave it meaning. The Cross name means something now because of you, not me." Ethan started visiting with me, and I watched Harold teach my son to play chess patient in ways he'd never been with me, telling stories about my childhood that acknowledged my strength rather than diminishing it. He told Ethan about the time I'd saved Jess from the kitchen fire, not the revised version where Jess was the hero, but the truth where I'd pulled her from flames at cost to myself. He told him about how I'd worked my way through school, how I'd built CrossCare from nothing, how I'd saved their house with money I didn't have. He was rewriting history not to make himself look better, but to give my son the truth about his mother that I'd never been given about myself. In February, I stood before Judge Morrison, the same county judge who'd processed the foreclosure 10 months earlier. Ava and I were seeking 501c3 status for the Cross Family Foundation, presenting our mission statement, bylaws, and plans for serving the community. The judge looked up from the paperwork and his face registered recognition. "You're the daughter who walked away," he said, and I braced myself for judgment. But he smiled something warm and approving. "And now you're the woman who came back, not to rescue people who wouldn't save themselves, but to help people who want to change. Application approved." The Cross Family Foundation opened its doors in March 2026, and by December we'd served over 200 elderly clients, each one carrying a story that echoed parts of my own history. We helped them navigate financial exploitation by adult children assisted with Medicaid applications that seemed designed to confuse and discourage, taught boundary setting to people who'd spent lifetimes believing that saying no to family meant they'd failed at love. The house that had been a monument to dysfunction became a refuge for people learning that protecting yourself wasn't the same as abandoning others. We held support groups on Thursday evenings, financial literacy workshops on Saturdays, and one-on-one counseling sessions throughout the week. Mrs. Bennett became one of our most valuable volunteers, showing up 3 days a week with the same observational skills she'd once used for gossip, now redirected toward identifying seniors who needed help. She'd walk through the neighborhood, strike up conversations at the grocery store, notice when someone's lawn went unmowed or mail piled up, and gently suggest they stop by the foundation. "I spent 20 years watching and judging," she told me one afternoon while we were setting up for a workshop. "I'd like to spend whatever time I have left watching and helping instead." She'd brought her folder of documentation about my family to our first board meeting, explaining that she wanted us to use her failure to protect her own daughter as a teaching tool. We created a display in the hallway, anonymous but detailed, showing how financial abuse escalates over time when nobody intervenes. Pastor Ruth's church became our first official partner, followed by 3 other congregations that understood their elderly members were vulnerable and needed support beyond Sunday services. Local news did a feature story in November, sending a reporter and camera crew to document what we'd built. They interviewed me in what used to be Mom's living room, now converted into a counseling space with comfortable chairs and tissues always within reach. When the reporter asked why I'd started the foundation, I gave her the truth. I watched my mother manipulate through money for decades, saw how she used financial control to maintain power over everyone around her. Now I'm helping others recognize and escape that pattern before it destroys them the way it almost destroyed me. Jess had sustained her transformation in ways that surprised both of us. She'd maintained her accounting position at Fisher & Associates for a full year, received a raise in October, and moved into a 3-bedroom apartment that she qualified for on her own income without needing me to co-sign. The apartment was modest, but clean, decorated with her children's artwork and furniture she'd bought secondhand and assembled herself. Watching her build a life from her own effort without bailouts or shortcuts showed me that change was possible even for people who'd spent decades proving otherwise. More importantly, she was parenting differently than Margaret had parented us. She set consistent bedtime routines and followed through on consequences when her kids broke rules. She didn't promise things she couldn't deliver, didn't buy their affection with toys she couldn't afford, didn't play favorites that would poison them the way favoritism had poisoned us. Her oldest, Madison, told me one Saturday while I was watching the kids so Jess could work an extra shift. "Mom is different now. She doesn't promise stuff she can't do anymore. And when she says she's proud of us, I actually believe her." Jess had also started attending a support group for codependent recovery, learning to recognize the patterns she'd inherited from Mom and choosing to break them. She'd become a sponsor for other women who were trying to escape family dysfunction, offering the same tough love I'd given her. I went to one of her meetings with her permission, sat in the back, and listened to her tell her story to a room full of women who understood exactly what she meant. "I was 35 years old before I paid my own rent," she said, her voice steady. "My mother's love nearly destroyed me because it wasn't love at all. It was control disguised as protection, and it left me completely unprepared for the basic requirements of adult life. I'm learning now what I should have learned at 18, and I'm grateful for the chance, even though it came so late." Ethan turned 12 in October, and in November, His English teacher assigned the same essay about family that had helped turn public opinion 2 years earlier. He wrote a piece titled, "What Real Family Looks Like," and didn't show it to me until after he'd turned it in. His teacher submitted it to the school district's writing competition, and he won first place in his age category. They read it at a school assembly in early December, and I sat in the auditorium crying while my son's words echoed through the speaker system. He wrote about watching me work multiple jobs after his father left, about hospital stays where I'd slept in a chair beside his bed for days, about learning that love was measured in actions rather than words. He wrote about Jess learning to show up consistently, about Harold learning to tell the truth before he died, about his grandfather Daniel, who'd missed 35 years, but was trying to make up for lost time. The conclusion of his essay destroyed me in the best way. Real family isn't who shares your blood or your house. Real family is who shows up when showing up is hard. My mom showed up every day of my life. My aunt learned to show up. My grandfather learned before he died. And I'm learning that love is something you do, not something you say. After the assembly, parents approached me in the parking lot, many with tears in their eyes. One woman, someone I'd never met before, grabbed my hand and said, "You're teaching the next generation what some of us never learned. My own mother was like yours, and I spent 40 years thinking that was normal. Your son just taught my daughter that it doesn't have to be." Another father told me he was going home to apologize to his kids for the ways he'd been repeating his own parents' mistakes without realizing it. Daniel had flown in for the assembly, sitting beside me and holding my hand while Ethan read. Afterward, he told me, "You broke the chain. Everything that's happened since, all these people being helped, all these families learning different patterns, it all started because you were strong enough to say no." As December settled in and Christmas decorations started appearing in store windows, my phone rang with Jess's number. I answered, expecting to coordinate our weekly dinner schedule, but her voice carried something different, something nervous and hopeful. "I want to host Christmas this year," she said. "At my place. Nothing fancy, just dinner and maybe some cookies the kids can decorate. I want it to be different from how we grew up. I want it to be real." She paused, and I could hear her breathing, gathering courage. "Would you come, you and Ethan and Daniel, if he's still in town? I know it's a lot to ask after what happened 2 years ago, but I'd really like us to be together." I looked out my window at the December afternoon, at lights starting to glow in neighboring houses, and felt something shift in my chest where old wounds had been. I said yes to Jess's invitation, but I needed to set a boundary that 2 years ago would have seemed impossible to enforce. "I'll come," I told her over the phone, "but Ethan comes with me this time. No separations, no different rules for different children. If we're doing this, we're doing it as a real family, where everyone is welcome." I braced myself for resistance, for excuses for some version of the old patterns to reassert themselves. Instead, Jess responded immediately without hesitation. "Of course he comes. All the kids are welcome. That's the whole point of this, Nadia. Nobody gets left outside this time." The simplicity of her agreement, the lack of defensiveness or justification, showed me how much had fundamentally shifted between us. 2 years ago, that same request would have triggered arguments about tradition and appropriateness, and ruining the mood. Now, it was just obvious, the baseline expectation, rather than a battle to be fought. I spent Christmas Eve morning cooking the same dishes I'd made 2 years before, the green bean casserole and roasted chicken and homemade rolls that had sat untouched while I'd watched my gifts get redistributed to children I wasn't allowed to see. This time, when I arrived at Jess's apartment with Ethan beside me and a warm casserole dish in my hands, the door opened to genuine welcome. The apartment was small, maybe a third the size of the house we'd grown up in, decorated with construction paper chains the kids had made, and handmade ornaments that hung slightly crooked on a tree that leaned a bit to the left. Nothing was perfect or expensive or designed to impress anyone. It was just real, the kind of Christmas that happened when people cared more about being together than about maintaining appearances. Daniel had flown in from Denver 2 days earlier and was already there when we arrived, along with my half-brothers Marcus and James and their wives and children. I was still getting used to having brothers, to the idea that family could expand rather than just contract, that blood ties could be discovered rather than just endured. Pastor Ruth arrived carrying a pie she'd baked, and Mrs. Bennett came with a plate of cookies, and suddenly Jess's small apartment was full of people who'd watched our family implode and were now witnessing something being built from those ruins. The kids disappeared into Jess's bedroom to play, and I could hear Ethan's laughter mixing with his cousins' voices, without anyone suggesting he was too fragile or too sick, or too much of a mood killer to be included. Jess moved through the space with an ease I'd never seen in her before, comfortable in the life she'd built rather than performing a role someone else had written for her. At one point, Madison came out holding something carefully wrapped in tissue paper. She walked to the tree and hung it on a branch at her eye level, a clay angel with slightly lopsided wings and a crooked halo painted in gold. I recognized it immediately as the ornament Ethan had made in art class last month, the one he'd been so proud of. "Ethan made this for us," Madison announced to the room. "Aunt Nadia, did you know he made this? Mom says we're keeping it forever, because love is what we do for each other, not what we expect from each other." Jess came to stand beside me, and we both looked at that imperfect angel hanging on that imperfect tree, and she said quietly, "I'm teaching them what we should have learned, that gifts matter because of who gave them, not because of how expensive they are." I couldn't speak for a moment, just nodded and squeezed her hand. Dinner was crowded around Jess's small table with folding chairs borrowed from neighbors, plates balanced on laps, kids eating on the floor like it was a picnic. The food was simple, and there was exactly enough, no grand display of abundance, just what we needed, and nothing more. Halfway through the meal, Emma, Jess's youngest at 6 years old, asked the question that made everyone stop chewing. "Mommy, why didn't we do Christmas at Grandma's house like we used to?" The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but felt longer. I watched Jess take a breath, saw her choose her words carefully, and felt proud of the woman she'd become. "Grandma loved us." Jess said, her voice gentle and honest. But she didn't always know how to show it in healthy ways. She made some people feel more welcome than others, and that hurt feelings. "We're learning to do better to make sure everyone feels like they belong," I added, because Emma was looking at me now with those wide, questioning eyes that children have when they're trying to understand complicated adult things. "Your grandma gave us a gift, even though she didn't mean to. She taught us what not to do. That's valuable too, learning from mistakes so we don't repeat them." Emma seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to her mashed potatoes. But later, as we were cleaning up, Ethan came to stand beside me at Jess's tiny kitchen sink. "Mom," he said quietly, "if Grandma were still alive and wanted to come to Christmas, would you let her in?" I dried my hands on a dish towel and knelt down so I could look him in the eye, this son who'd been excluded from a celebration 2 years ago and was now asking me about grace and boundaries and the complicated mathematics of forgiveness. "Yes," I said honestly, I would let her in, but she'd have to sit at a table she never gave me, and she'd have to follow the rules we set, the ones that say everyone matters equally. She'd have to accept that your presence isn't negotiable, that love doesn't get to pick favorites. I paused, making sure he understood. Sometimes love means saying yes with conditions, not just yes to everything or no to everything. Ethan nodded, processing this, and then hugged me hard before running back to play with his cousins. Daniel, who'd been standing nearby and overheard, came over and put his hand on my shoulder. "That's wisdom he'll carry his whole life," he said. "You're teaching him that boundaries and love can coexist." As the evening wound down and people started gathering coats and leftover containers, I stood in Jess's living room looking at the space she'd created. The apartment was modest, the furniture was secondhand, the decorations were homemade, and none of it looked like the grand house we'd grown up in with its perfect Christmas tree and expensive presents and toxic undercurrents. This was better. This was real. I found Jess in the kitchen finishing the dishes, and I wrapped my arms around her from behind, resting my chin on her shoulder the way sisters do when words aren't quite enough. "This is what real family looks like," I said quietly. "Everyone belongs. Nobody gets left in the car. Nobody's love gets stolen and rebranded. Just people showing up for each other because they choose to, not because they're obligated." Jess turned around and hugged me properly, and I felt her tears on my shoulder. "Thank you for giving me another chance," she whispered. "Thank you for believing I could be different." "You did the work," I whispered back. "I just stopped preventing consequences. You're the one who chose to change." We stood there in her small kitchen, holding each other, two women who'd survived the same childhood and come out the other side with different scars, but the same determination to break the patterns that had tried to break us. Outside, snow was starting to fall, and through the window I could see Ethan and his cousins catching snowflakes on their tongues. All of them welcome, all of them loved, none of them excluded. This was redemption. Not perfect, not without scars, but real and earned and worth every hard choice that had led us here. The success of that Christmas gathering led to something neither Jess nor I had planned, but both of us needed. In January, we started having Sunday dinners rotating between my house 1 week, her apartment the next, and potluck at the foundation, the 3rd week of each month. The 4th Sunday, we kept open, understanding that life happened, and sometimes people needed space or had other commitments. These weren't mandatory gatherings weighed down with guilt and obligation like the holidays of our childhood. They were voluntary, built on genuine desire to be together, rather than fear of what would happen if we didn't show up. The first time someone couldn't make it, I held my breath, waiting for the drama. The accusations of not caring, the wounded martyrdom that would have characterized Mom's response to any absence. Instead, Jess just texted, "No problem, see you next week," when Daniel had to cancel because of a work emergency in Denver. That simple, drama-free acceptance of someone's legitimate conflict felt revolutionary. We were building something new, patterns that didn't require perfect attendance to prove love that could bend without breaking. By spring, these dinners had become the anchor of our weeks. The kids looked forward to them, Ethan and his cousins developing actual relationships instead of the forced proximity of obligatory gatherings. One Sunday in March, while we were cleaning up after dinner at my house, Jess said something that made me stop drying dishes and look at her. "I used to dread family gatherings," she said, scraping plates into the compost bin. "The whole week before, I'd feel this anxiety building, knowing I had to perform being happy, knowing Mom would critique everything I said or did. Now I actually look forward to Sundays. That's how I know we've really changed. It's not what we're doing that's different, it's how it feels." In February, the foundation started offering a monthly workshop that Jess and I co-taught called Money, Boundaries, and Love. It was designed for mothers and daughters to attend together, learning financial literacy while also discussing the emotional dynamics that made money such a weapon in dysfunctional families. We used our own story as a cautionary tale, having gotten permission from the kids to discuss our family history in age-appropriate ways that protected their privacy while illustrating the patterns we were trying to help others avoid. The workshop met on the last Saturday of each month, and we typically had 15 to 20 pairs of women ranging from teenagers with their mothers to women in their 60s with their elderly mothers. Jess handled the financial literacy portion, teaching budgeting and credit management with the authority of someone who'd learned these lessons the hard way. I facilitated the discussion about boundaries and emotional manipulation, drawing on both my professional experience with elderly clients and my personal experience of being financially exploited by family. During the March session, a teenage girl named Sophia raised her hand and asked me a question I'd been expecting, but still found difficult. "Do you hate your mom?" she asked, her voice uncertain but curious. "After everything she did to you, after she stole from you and lied about you, do you hate her?" I thought about how to answer honestly without being cruel. How to model the complexity of grief for someone who'd lost a parent not to death, but to their own choices. "I hate what she did," I said slowly. "I hate the patterns she created, the pain she caused, the years I spent thinking I was the problem. I'm sad about who she could have been if she'd done the work to heal herself instead of passing her wounds to the next generation. But I don't hate her anymore. Hate takes energy I'd rather spend on people who are still here and trying." I looked around the room at all these mothers and daughters who were trying to break patterns before they became irreparable. Hating her would mean she still controlled me, just in a different way. I chose to let her go instead. Sophia nodded, and her mother squeezed her hand, and I saw something shift in both their faces. This was why we did the workshop These Moments, where people realized that acknowledging harm didn't mean you had to carry hatred forever, that you could set boundaries without becoming bitter. Daniel had become a steady presence in our lives, visiting from Denver once a month and calling every Sunday evening to check in. He was careful not to overstep, never trying to replace Harold or rewrite history, but simply adding himself to our family structure in whatever way we had room for. In March, he established a scholarship through the Foundation for Single Mothers, returning to school funding it with $50,000 annually and insisting it be anonymous. "I don't want credit," he told me when I tried to thank him publicly. "I want to make sure my financial support creates opportunities instead of dependency. You taught me that. Money should open doors, not close them." He'd also started teaching Ethan woodworking during his monthly visits, setting up a small workshop in my garage with tools he'd brought from Colorado. I'd watch them through the window, my 12-year-old son and my 56-year-old father heads, bent over a piece of wood, Daniel showing Ethan how to measure twice and cut once, how to sand with the grain, how to build something that would last. It was the grandfather relationship Ethan had never had built, not on obligation or proximity, but on choice and effort. One Saturday afternoon, while they were working on a bookshelf for Ethan's room, I heard Ethan ask the question I'd been wondering if he'd ever voice. "Why didn't you raise my mom?" His voice was curious, not accusatory. "If you're her dad, why wasn't you there when she was growing up?" I started to move toward the garage to intervene to protect Daniel from having to explain his absence to a child. But Daniel saw me through the window and shook his head slightly. He wanted to answer this himself. I stayed where I was, close enough to hear, but giving them space. "I didn't know your mom existed," Daniel said, his voice carrying through the open garage door. "Her mother and I were together briefly when we were very young, and I left town before anyone knew she was pregnant. By the time I found out 35 years later, your mom had built a whole life. I was scared that showing up would hurt her more than help her, so I watched from far away to make sure she was okay." He paused, and I heard the rasp of sandpaper against wood. "I made mistakes, Ethan. I was a coward when I should have been brave. But your mom taught me something important. It's never too late to try. I can't get back the years I missed, but I can show up for the years we have left." There was silence for a moment, and then Ethan said, "I'm glad you're here now." Just that simple and accepting in the way children can be when adults are honest with them. In April, on a Tuesday afternoon when the foundation was busy with its usual activity, Mrs. Bennett came in with a young woman I didn't recognize. The woman was maybe 25, with dark circles under her eyes, and the hunched shoulders of someone carrying weight they didn't know how to put down. Mrs. Bennett walked her straight to my office, knocked on the door frame, and said something that made everything we'd built suddenly feel like it had purpose beyond just our own healing. "Nadia, this is my granddaughter Claire. She needs the kind of help I never knew how to give." Claire became the Foundation's 400th client that spring, and by Christmas 2027, we'd served over 600 elderly individuals, each one a testament to the idea that patterns could be broken if someone was willing to do the uncomfortable work of intervening. The numbers told part of the story. 43 financial exploitation cases, prevented 127 family mediations, facilitated countless boundaries established where there had only been manipulation before. But the real measure wasn't in statistics. It was in the thank you notes we received, the elderly women who learned to say no to adult children demanding money, the families who found ways to love each other without destroying each other in the process. On Ethan's 13th birthday in October, I wrote him a letter he wouldn't read for 5 more years. I sat at my kitchen table on a Sunday evening and tried to put into words what I'd learned from our family's implosion and reconstruction. What wisdom I could pass down that might save him from having to learn these lessons the hard way. I wrote about Margaret and Harold, about Jess's transformation, about the Christmas that had finally broken me free from patterns I'd been trapped in since childhood. I explained the betrayals and the forgiveness and the careful boundaries we'd built to protect ourselves while still remaining open to connection. The most important paragraph took me an hour to write, revising and refining until the words felt true. I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or allowing harm to continue. It means releasing yourself from the prison of someone else's choices. Forgive people who hurt you, but never fund their cruelty. Love people who fail you, but never teach your children that love requires self-destruction. You are worth more than what you can provide to others. Your value isn't in what you give up. It's in who you are when nobody's asking you for anything. I sealed the letter and placed it in a safe deposit box, along with the financial documentation of everything that had happened, a legacy more valuable than any inheritance I could leave him. Someday he'd read it and understand why his mother had made the choices she'd made, why peace had been worth more than keeping a family together that was built on dysfunction. In November, a producer from a national news program contacted the foundation asking to do a feature story on our work. The piece aired the week before Thanksgiving, and suddenly we were receiving calls from across the country. People asking how to start similar organizations in their communities, elderly individuals reaching out because they'd finally found language for what was happening to them. A congressional staffer saw the segment and reached out asking if I'd be willing to testify at a hearing about elder financial abuse. In early December, I flew to Washington and sat before a committee of senators and representatives telling a story that was mine, but also belonged to millions of families navigating the same painful dynamics. I didn't mention Mom by name, didn't use the hearing as an opportunity to air personal grievances to a national audience. I'd moved beyond needing that kind of acknowledgement. Instead, I focused on systemic solutions, stronger legal protections for elderly individuals, mandatory reporting requirements for financial institutions, community education programs in schools and churches. I talked about how financial abuse often looked like love, how manipulation disguised itself as family loyalty, how victims stayed silent because speaking up meant admitting their own children were stealing from them. After my testimony, Senator Williams approached me in the hallway and shook my hand. "You turned your pain into policy," she said. "That's real strength. A lot of people would have just stayed angry. You built something that helps others instead." Christmas 2027 fell on a Saturday, and we gathered at the foundation headquarters, the house that had represented everything wrong with our family, now symbolizing everything we'd managed to overcome. Jess and her kids arrived first, followed by Daniel and my half-brothers with their families. Pastor Ruth came with her husband, and Mrs. Bennett brought Claire, who'd been working at the foundation as a volunteer while rebuilding her own life. The children decorated the tree together without adult supervision, hanging ornaments at whatever height they could reach, creating something beautifully imperfect. Ethan climbed a stepladder to place the angel on top, the same clay angel he'd made 4 years ago, slightly chipped now, but still recognizable. I watched him balance it carefully on the highest branch and thought about everything that had changed since he'd first created it. He'd grown 4 inches. His voice had started changing, his heart condition was stable under careful management. But more than physical changes, he'd grown up watching his mother choose dignity over dysfunction, watching his aunt transform herself through accountability, learning that family was something you built through choice, rather than something you endured because of blood. As evening fell and we gathered around the tree with hot chocolate and cookies the kids had decorated earlier, someone asked me the question I'd been asking myself for 3 years. It was Marcus Daniel's younger son who'd become close enough over the years to ask hard questions. "Nadia, do you ever regret what you did? Walking away letting the house foreclose all of it?" I looked around at the faces gathered in that living room, each one representing a different piece of healing. Jess, confident and employed and genuinely present for her children. Daniel, who'd spent 30 years thinking he'd lost his chance to know his daughter and had been given an unexpected second act. Mrs. Bennett, who'd turned decades of gossiping into purpose by helping vulnerable people. Pastor Ruth, who'd watched our family implode and supported us through rebuilding. Ethan, who was learning that love didn't mean accepting cruelty. And me, finally free from the prison of other people's expectations. "I regret what I didn't do sooner," I said honestly. "I regret the years I spent funding my own erasure, teaching my son that love meant accepting mistreatment. But I don't regret the boundaries I finally set. They saved my life." Later. After everyone had gone home, and I was alone in the foundation offices, I sat in what used to be Mom's bedroom and thought about the journey from that Christmas Eve 3 years ago to this moment. Peace wasn't the absence of conflict. It was what remained when you stopped fighting battles you were never meant to win. Revenge would have been making them hurt as much as they'd hurt me. Justice was stopping the hurt altogether for myself and for everyone who came after. I'd chosen justice. And in the quiet that followed in the space I'd created by refusing to carry other people's shame anymore, I finally heard my own voice saying what I'd needed to hear my entire life. You are enough. You were always enough. Not because of what you give or what you sacrifice or how much pain you can endure, but because you exist, because you survived, because you learned to choose yourself when everyone else had chosen someone else. That was the victory. Not dramatic or loud or satisfying in the way revenge might have been. Just quiet and true and mine. And it was enough. 3 years ago, I stood at my parents' door holding a casserole dish and my son's hand, believing that family meant enduring whatever pain they chose to inflict. I thought love required me to fund my own erasure, to accept being treated as less than to teach my child that his worth was negotiable based on other people's comfort. That Christmas Eve changed everything, not because I sought revenge, but because I finally understood that boundaries aren't cruelty and that choosing yourself isn't selfish. The journey from that frozen moment outside their door to standing in a foundation built from the ruins of dysfunction taught me something I want every person watching this to hear. You don't owe anyone access to your life at the cost of your dignity. My mother spent decades using money as control, but what she never understood was that the real power wasn't in the giving. It was in the ability to stop. When I canceled those payments, I wasn't punishing them. I was refusing to participate in my own destruction. When the house foreclosed, when they faced consequences for the first time in their lives, it wasn't revenge. It was simply reality arriving after I'd stopped holding it back. And yes, it was painful. Yes, there were moments when I questioned whether I'd done the right thing. But 3 years later, looking at my son who knows his worth isn't measured by what he can endure. Looking at my sister who learned accountability can coexist with love. Looking at a foundation that helps hundreds of people escape the same patterns that nearly destroyed me. I know that choosing peace over performance was the bravest thing I've ever done. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family or questioned whether setting boundaries makes you the villain, I want you to know you're not alone. Thousands of people are walking this same path, learning that family should feel like belonging, not like captivity. This channel exists to tell these stories, to shine light on the dynamics we're taught to keep private, to remind you that your pain is valid and your boundaries are necessary. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story of people choosing themselves after a lifetime of choosing everyone else. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to set a boundary that others called cruel, but you knew was survival? Have you walked away from family that demanded you stay? Your story matters, and this community is here to witness it without judgment. Share this video with someone who needs permission to stop funding their own erasure. Someone who's been told that love means accepting mistreatment. Someone who needs to hear that they are enough exactly as they are. Remember, peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's what remains when you stop fighting battles you were never meant to win. Choose yourself. You've always been worth choosing. Thank you for listening to my story. I'll see you in the next one.